It started at 3:07 a.m., the exact time my truck's onboard clock flickered to life after a brief blackout. I was hauling a load of lumber through the desolate back roads of Wyoming. No streetlights, no cell phone signal, just me, 60,000 pounds of timber, and a stretch of highway that felt like it was folding in on itself. The darkness outside the cab was so thick, it felt alive, pressing against the glass, whispering promises of secrets better left buried. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled, a burst of static that made me flinch. My hand darted to the dial to turn it off, but then I heard a voice. "Breaker, breaker, Midnight Hauler, you out there? You're driving right through Hell's Mile." I froze. Hell's Mile wasn't on the map, but I'd heard stories from old-timers at truck stops. A cursed stretch of road, they said, where drivers disappeared, leaving their rigs abandoned. Nobody knew what happened to them, just that their trucks were found with doors wide open and the engines still idling. My heart thumped as I pressed the button to reply. This is Midnight Hauler. Who's this?" The voice came back, low and gravelly, with an edge that crawled under my skin. "Name's Redeye. Listen close. You're not going to make it through unless you follow my lead. Stay on Channel 7 and don't stop for anything." The road ahead was endless black, my high beams barely cutting through the void. Redeye's voice had rattled me, but curiosity, or maybe fear, kept me tuned in. "Why should I trust you?" I asked, gripping the wheel tight enough for my knuckles to go white. Redeye's laughter crackled through the static, hollow and humorless. "Because I have seen what's out there, Midnight Hauler. And trust me, you don't want to meet it. Keep your eyes on the road and your foot on the gas." The CB went silent, leaving only the hum of the engine. I scanned the mirrors out of habit, but saw nothing but the swirling dark. Then I noticed something. The shadow at the edge of my headlights wasn't staying still. It was crawling, bending unnaturally, stretching long, thin limbs that didn't belong to anything human. My pulse quickened. It was on the road. I floored it. The truck groaned under the weight of its load as I pushed it harder, the speedometer creeping past safe limits. Whatever that thing was, it was keeping pace, its spindly, insect-like legs clicking against the pavement as it gained on me. "Redeye, what the hell is this thing?" I yelled into the CB. "You don't stop. You hear me?" he barked. "No matter what it does, no matter what it looks like, you don't stop. It's gonna try. They always do." I didn't have time to ask what he meant. Ahead, the shadow darted into my lane, expanding until it took the shape of a man in a trucker's cap, waving his arms frantically, his mouth moving as if he was screaming. I slammed the brakes out of instinct. "No!" Redeye's voice roared. "That's not a man!" It was too late. The truck screeched to a halt, the back end fishtailing. The figure disappeared under the hood, but there was no thump, no impact, just silence. My breath hitched as I scanned the mirrors. The road was empty again. Then the cab lights flickered. I reached for the door lock, but before my fingers could touch the button, a long skeletal hand slammed against the driver's side window. My scream caught in my throat as I stared into its face, or what was pretending to be a face. Eyes like polished obsidian. A slit where a mouth should have been, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. It grinned at me, tapping the glass with a claw. "Drive, Midnight Hauler," Redeye's voice growled. "Now!" My body moved on autopilot. I jammed the truck into gear and slammed the accelerator. The thing outside shrieked, a sound that felt like it was tearing into my brain, but I didn't dare look back. "Don't let it hitch a ride," Redeye warned. "If it gets in, it's over." "What the hell is this thing?" I shouted. Redeye sighed, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Just one of many. The road's got rules, Midnight Hauler. break them, and it don't let you leave. Keep driving." I drove. The thing followed. For miles, it stayed just outside the glow of my lights, flickering in and out of view like a bad signal. Every now and then, I'd hear it scraping against the trailer, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, I saw the faint glow of a truck stop ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly. Red-Eye's voice crackled back on. "When you hit the lot, park under the brightest light. Stay in the cab. Don't look at anyone, no matter what. Got it?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Got it. The truck stop was deserted. I pulled into a spot directly under the buzzing fluorescent lights, killed the engine, and locked the doors. Then I waited. For a while, there was nothing, just the hum of the lights and the distant creak of the wind. I almost let myself relax, until I saw the first figure emerge from the shadows. It looked like a trucker. Greasy ball cap, flannel shirt, steel-toe boots, but its movements were wrong. Too jerky, like a marionette being yanked around by invisible strings. It stopped at the edge of the lot, staring directly at me. Then another joined it, and another. Soon, the lot was full of them, all staring at the cab, not moving, just staring. "Red-Eye?" I whispered into the CB. No response. One of them stepped forward, its face splitting into that same needle-toothed grin. My heart slammed against my ribs as it raised a hand, pointing directly at me. Then the cab light flickered again. I closed my eyes, whispering every prayer I could think of, and slammed my hand onto the horn. The blaring sound echoed across the lot, and for a moment, the figures hesitated. When I opened my eyes, they were gone. The CB crackled. "You made it, Midnight Hauler." Red-Eye's voice was calm now, almost relieved. "But don't ever come back this way. The road doesn't forget." I didn't reply. I just started the engine and drove, the neon glow of the truck stop fading into the rearview mirror. I never used those back roads again, and I never figured out who or what Red-Eye really was. But sometimes, on the loneliest stretches of highway, my CB crackles to life, and a voice I haven't heard in years whispers, "Breaker, breaker. Midnight Hauler, you still out there?" It's hard to explain the kind of fear that grips you when you've got 80,000 pounds of steel barreling down an empty highway at 3 a.m. And something in your gut tells you the road ahead isn't empty. But that's trucking life. You either trust your instincts or learn the hard way why you should have. I'd been running long hauls for years, but this particular route felt wrong. It wasn't the road conditions or the weather. It was clear skies and smooth asphalt. No, this was something else. The kind of thing you can't explain without sounding crazy, like how the shadows seemed a little too dark, or the way the wind hummed through the trees in a pitch that almost sounded like a voice. The job was straightforward. Pick up a load of industrial equipment in Fargo, drop it in Billings, and keep the logbook clean. Simple. But as I pulled onto a stretch of Highway 212, a notorious loner road through Montana, the CB crackled to life. "You out there eastbound?" The voice was male, gruff, and tinged with static. I grabbed the mic. "Eastbound, yeah. Who's asking?" A pause. Then, "Just a friendly warning. Don't stop for nothing past mile marker 140. Ain't worth it." Before I could respond, the line went dead. Now, I'm not one to scare easy. I've heard my share of CB ghost stories, phantom hitchhikers, glowing eyes in the woods. But they're just campfire tales, right? Still, the guy's tone stuck with me. It wasn't jokey or playful. It was dead serious. And then I saw it. A hitchhiker, standing just past mile marker 140. The hitchhiker didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there with their thumb out. The figure was tall, wrapped in what looked like an old military coat, and their face was hidden under the brim of a wide hat. My headlights barely lit them up, and as I rolled closer, I had this overwhelming feeling in my chest, like a warning bell going off in my head. I kept driving, didn't even think about stopping, but as I passed, my rearview mirror caught something that made my stomach drop. The hitchhiker turned their head to watch me go. Only, it wasn't a head. It was wrong. Too pale, too smooth, like it was carved out of wax, and the eyes, if you could even call them that, were hollow. Just empty pits. I punched the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb past 70, 80, 85. My trailer swayed a little, but I didn't care. I just wanted distance between me and whatever the hell that thing was. The CB crackled again. "You saw it, didn't you?" The same voice, gruff, static-laden. "What the hell was that?" I barked into the mic, keeping one hand locked on the wheel. "Didn't I tell you not to stop?" The voice wasn't angry. It sounded resigned. "You're lucky it didn't follow you." "Follow me? What are you talking about?" My heart was hammering, but before I could get an answer, the CB cut out again, replaced by a strange hum, low and almost melodic, like a vibration coming from deep in the earth. And then, the temperature in the cab dropped. I could see my breath fog up the windshield. A shadow darted across the road, just ahead of my truck. I slammed on the brakes, and the whole rig shuddered, tires screaming against the asphalt. The truck groaned to a stop, my trailer fishtailing slightly behind me. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then, a knock. It came from the passenger door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't turn my head. I didn't want to see what was out there. I just gripped the wheel tighter, hoping, praying it would go away. Another knock. I don't know what came over me, but I finally snapped. Reaching under my seat, I grabbed the tire iron I kept for emergencies and swung the door open, ready to fight. Nothing. The road was empty, but there were footprints, bare, human-shaped footprints in the frost on the passenger side step. They trailed away into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I jumped back into the cab, locked the doors, and threw the truck into gear. My only goal was to get the hell off that road. I didn't stop until I hit Billings, parking at the first truck stop I saw. The place was mostly deserted, save for a few other haulers grabbing late-night coffee. I climbed down, legs shaking, and headed inside. At the counter, I told the cashier, an older guy with a face full of wrinkles, about what I'd seen. He didn't laugh or brush me off. Instead, he just nodded grimly. "Let me guess," he said. "Highway 212, around mile marker 140? How'd you know?" He sighed. "You're not the first trucker to see it. That stretch of road's got a reputation. Something about an old accident back in the 60s. Bus full of soldiers flipped over in the snowstorm. Only thing is, they never found the bodies." I stared at him, my coffee suddenly tasting like ash. "You're telling me that thing out there?" He just shrugged. "All I know is, don't stop. Doesn't matter what you see or hear, just keep driving." It's been a few years since that night, but I still avoid Highway 212 whenever I can. And when I can't, I make sure I don't stop for anything. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, there's something watching, and it's waiting for the next driver foolish enough to pull over. I knew better than to pick up hitchhikers. Every trucker does. It's one of the first rules they drill into your head when you're fresh on the road. But there's something about a cold Nebraska night and the sight of a lone figure under the glow of a busted rest stop lamp that can make you forget the rules. The man had his thumb out, shivering under layers of mismatched jackets. I slowed my rig, the hiss of the brakes cutting through the silent night. He didn't rush to the cab like most hitchhikers would. Instead, he stood there, waiting as if he knew I'd stop. That should have been my first warning. "You heading west?" he asked when I cracked the window. I nodded, unlocking the door. He climbed in, bringing with him the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. "Thanks," he muttered, settling into the passenger seat. He kept his face low, shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat. His hands were bare, pale against the dark interior. We hit the road, the hum of the engine filling the silence. I asked the usual questions: where he was headed, what brought him out here. His answers were vague, almost rehearsed. "Just need to get to the next town," he'd say, or "caught a bit of bad luck." But as the miles ticked by, something felt off. He didn't fidget or shift in his seat like most passengers. He sat rigid, eyes fixed on the horizon. I glanced at him whenever I thought he wouldn't notice, but every time I did, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. "Mind if I turn on the radio?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "No," he said sharply. Too sharply, then softer. "I prefer the quiet." Fine by me. I liked quiet too. But this kind of quiet, the kind where your own breathing seems too loud, it was suffocating. We'd been driving for about an hour when I noticed something strange. Every time we passed a mile marker, the numbers were wrong. At first, I thought it was fatigue. Maybe I was misreading them. But then it became undeniable. Mile 247, mile 248, mile 247 again. I squinted into the rearview mirror, expecting to see some logical explanation. Maybe another truck with a similar sign reflecting back. But there was nothing behind us, just the empty road. "You see that?" I asked, my voice tight. The hitchhiker didn't answer. "Hey," I said louder, glancing over, but the passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The cab jolted to a stop, and my heart pounded in the sudden stillness. My eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any trace of him. The seatbelt was still buckled, swaying slightly as if someone had just left it. Then, from the sleeper behind me, came a low, rasping breath. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to bolt. The breath behind me was slow and deliberate, the kind of sound that someone makes when they know you're trapped. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I tried to rationalize what was happening. He couldn't have gotten back there. It was impossible. But the breath came again, louder this time, like whoever or whatever was in the sleeper wanted me to know they were there. "Who's back there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. I reached over to the passenger seat, grabbing the tire iron I kept under the dash. The silence that followed was worse than the breathing. It stretched on, thick and oppressive, until I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, I turned in my seat, raising the tire iron. My flashlight was clipped to the dash, and I snatched it up, aiming its beam into the sleeper. It was empty. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. The blanket was crumpled where I'd left it, the small space undisturbed. But then I noticed something out of place. A smear of wetness trailing from the sleeper's edge down to the floor. It was dark, almost black, and it glistened under the flashlight's beam. Blood. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever was in my truck wasn't human. The cab lights flickered, once, twice. Then they went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight flickered too, struggling against some unseen force. In the dim, erratic glow, I saw movement. Something shifted in the corner of the sleeper, impossibly tall, impossibly wrong. Its shape defied logic. its edges too sharp and fluid all at once, like it was struggling to stay in this world. A low, guttural sound filled the cabin, a voice, but not one made by anything living. "You shouldn't have stopped." The flashlight died, leaving me in pitch black. I scrambled to start the truck, fumbling with the keys as icy fear crawled up my spine. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the night, but the figure was gone, leaving only the smear of blood as proof it had been there at all. I didn't wait. I slammed the rig into gear and hit the accelerator, tires squealing as I sped down the highway. The mile markers were still wrong, looping back on themselves, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The radio crackled to life, though I hadn't touched it. Static filled the cab, followed by that same guttural voice. "You can't run." The headlights dimmed, and for a terrifying moment, the road disappeared. I was driving blind, the truck lurching as I fought to keep it steady. When the lights came back on, I was no longer on the highway. The asphalt had been replaced by cracked, ancient cobblestones and dense, towering trees pressed in on either side of the narrow path. This wasn't Nebraska. This wasn't anywhere. The radio crackled again, the voice low and mocking. "Welcome home." I drove faster, the rig barely fitting between the trees. Shadows darted through the underbrush, too quick and too large to be animals. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the unknown. My heart raced, my grip on the wheel like a vice. Whatever was out there, I couldn't let it catch me. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the path opened up, and I was back on the highway. The mile markers were normal again, counting up as they should. I eased off the accelerator, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The radio was silent. The cab was empty. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, pulling into the brightly lit lot like it was a sanctuary. Shutting off the engine, I climbed out and leaned against the truck, my legs shaking. The night was calm, the stars shining overhead as if nothing had happened. But when I looked back at the cab, I saw it. A smear of black, oily blood trailing down the inside of the passenger door. I never picked up another hitchhiker. And now, every time I'm on the road at night, I watch the mile markers. Because one day, I know they'll start counting backwards again. And this time, I might not escape. The evening air was thick with the smell of wet hay and the faint metallic tang of old tools. The wind carried a strange, almost melodic whistling sound that seemed to rise and fall, as if it was alive and moving just beyond the edge of the cornfield. That's where I was, alone on my grandfather's farm for the weekend. He'd left a list of chores, but I was mostly there to keep an eye on the livestock. Easy enough. It started with the chickens. Around midnight, I heard them squawking, not their usual restless chatter, but a frenzied, chaotic scream that shot me bolt upright in bed. Grabbing the flashlight by the door, I shoved my feet into my boots and headed out. The barnyard was quiet, except for the frantic rustling inside the coop. When I opened the door, my stomach twisted. Something had ripped through the chicken wire, leaving a gaping hole. Feathers floated in the air like soft snow, and the floor was littered with streaks of blood. There were no tracks outside, just the hole and the silence. Too much silence. Even the frogs in the pond weren't croaking. I convinced myself it was a fox or maybe a coyote, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. By 2 a.m., the rain started, a steady, cold drizzle. I was lying in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, when the faint sound of movement reached my ears. It wasn't coming from the house, but from somewhere outside. It was a low, dragging sound, punctuated by wet thuds, as if something heavy was being pulled through the mud. I hesitated for too long before grabbing the shotgun from the rack. As I stepped outside, the rain soaked me instantly, plastering my shirt to my skin. The sound was louder now. It was coming from the silo. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered planks dark against the stormy sky. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the rain, knocking loose a tarp. But as I approached, the dragging sound stopped. I swung the flashlight beam towards the base of the silo. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over the pile of spilled corn, its arms long and bony, the skin stretched tight over sharp joints. Its back was to me, but its movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze, the beam of light shaking as my hands trembled. Whatever it was, it turned its head slowly, unnaturally far, until its face was visible in profile. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth impossibly wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked more like shards of broken glass. It grinned, a thin, split-lipped smile that made my knees buckle. And then it stood. It was tall, too tall. It had to duck as it turned fully towards me. In its clawed hand, it held a chicken, what was left of one. It dropped the carcass, and the wet thud echoed in the silence. The thing started towards me, its movements fluid now, almost hypnotic. I ran. The mud sucked at my boots as I sprinted back to the house. I didn't dare look back, not even when I heard the wet slapping of its footsteps gaining on me. By the time I reached the door, I was screaming. I slammed it shut, bolting the lock and shoving the kitchen table against it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside. The porch creaked as it stepped up, and I could hear it sniffing, the sound wet and guttural. Then, nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, the shotgun cradled in my arms, the flashlight trained on the door. It didn't return. Not that night. But the farm wasn't the same after that. Strange things kept happening. The cows refused to graze near the silo, and I found deep clawed marks gouged into the barn doors. And every night, without fail, that melodic whistling would drift through the air, growing louder as it approached the house. I left that farm the next morning, my chores undone. I never told my grandfather what happened. I didn't have to. When he called me weeks later, his voice was shaking. He said something was out there, something that didn't belong. He never saw it, but he heard the whistling. He sold the farm not long after that. Last I heard, the new owners abandoned it after their son disappeared. They said he was playing near the silo. I know better. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the farm and the horrors stayed there, tied to the land like a bad dream. But things like that don't let go so easily. They follow you. They linger. A few months after I left, I moved to the city, hoping the crowded streets and constant hum of life would drown out the memories. It worked for a while. I even started sleeping better, the image of that grinning, hollow-eyed thing fading with time. Then, one night, I heard it again. I was walking home late, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural in a city. I'd just turned a corner when I heard it. The whistling, that same melodic tune, the one I had convinced myself was just the wind back on the farm. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was faint, almost playful, coming from somewhere up ahead. Slowly, I turned my head. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing, just empty sidewalks and parked cars. Then, it stepped into the light. It was the same as before, tall, gangly, its skin stretched taut over bones that seemed to shift and crack as it moved. Its eyes locked on mine, black and endless, and it smiled that impossible smile. But now, It was wearing something. A tattered flannel shirt and overalls, smeared with mud and blood, as if mocking the life I'd tried to leave behind. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, it began to move. Not running, not lunging, but walking, slow and deliberate, each step a taunt. I did the only thing I could. I ran. The streets blurred as I sprinted, my lungs burning with each gasp of icy air. The whistling followed, growing louder, closer, no matter how fast I ran. I turned corner after corner, desperately searching for someone, anyone. But the city seemed empty, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving me alone with that thing. Finally, I spotted an old church, its heavy oak doors slightly ajar. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the iron bolt into place. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then the whistling started again, just outside the door. It circled the building, the sound rising and falling as it moved, always just out of sight. I backed away, clutching a heavy candlestick I'd grabbed from the altar. My eyes darted to the stained glass windows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched across the floor, long and spindly, growing larger as it moved closer to the window. Slowly, its face came into view, distorted by the colored glass, but unmistakable. It pressed a hand, if you could call it that, against the window, the claws clicking softly against the pane. And then, it smiled. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I passed out. All I know is that when I woke up, the church was empty, the doors still bolted, and the whistling was gone. But it left something behind. On the floor, in the faint light filtering through the stained glass, was a single feather, blood-stained and torn, just like the ones from the coop on the farm. I moved again after that, farther this time. Different city, different state, but no matter where I go, I hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, that faint mocking tune, carried on a wind that doesn't belong. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know this: it's still out there, somewhere, and it's still watching. So, if you're ever out in the countryside and you hear whistling, don't follow it. Don't look for the source. Just run and pray it isn't looking for you. It started with a bet. I was bored, drunk, and feeling invincible when I said I'd spend the night out at Widow's Creek Farm. For years, it had been the town's favorite spooky story, the abandoned farmhouse, where people swore they heard voices, saw shadows moving in the windows. Local legend said the owner, Mr. Eldridge, vanished one night, and no one had been able to buy or sell the property since. Something about the land made people uneasy, but I didn't believe in all that. Armed with a flashlight, a folding chair, and a thermos of coffee, I set out to prove everyone wrong. By the time I got to the farm, the moon was low and hazy, casting just enough light to turn the barn and house into black, jagged silhouettes against the night sky. I parked the truck at the edge of the property and made my way to the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the absolute stillness. Inside, the house smelled like wet rot. My flashlight beam swept over faded wallpaper and furniture covered in sheets. But what struck me was the silence. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. Easy, I muttered to myself, setting up my chair in the front room where I had a clear view of the kitchen and stairs. Just a night alone in an old house. The first few hours passed without incident. I tried to stream music, but the signal was dead. That's when I heard it, a faint thud upstairs. My flashlight shot toward the staircase, catching nothing but empty steps. It's just the house settling, I told myself. though my pulse was already quickening. And then, the lantern flickered to life. It was sitting on the kitchen table, a rusty oil lantern I hadn't noticed before. A weak yellow flame danced inside, casting moving shadows on the walls. I froze. There was no one here. No one could have lit it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The lantern flame sputtered as if in response, then settled into a steady glow. I stepped closer, my boots dragging against the warped floorboards. The lantern's glass was clean, the wick trimmed. Someone had been here recently. I turned in a circle, shining my light into every corner of the room, but saw nothing. Then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from above me, slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end of the house to the other. My flashlight darted to the ceiling as the sound moved toward the top of the staircase. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. The footsteps stopped. The lantern, sitting on the table just a moment before, was suddenly at the foot of the stairs. Its flame flared brightly, and for a second, I thought I saw something behind it. A shadowy figure, long and thin, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I ran. I bolted out the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The truck was parked just a few hundred feet away, but as I ran, the air grew thick. My legs felt heavy, like wading through molasses. I glanced back over my shoulder and stopped dead. The farmhouse was ablaze with light, every window glowing fiercely. Figures stood in the glass, tall, thin shapes that didn't move, just watched as I struggled to breathe. And then the barn door slammed open. Something crawled out of the darkness. It was on all fours, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I screamed and turned back toward the truck, pushing through whatever force was holding me back. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, but the thing was right behind me now. I felt its breath, hot, wet, and rancid, on the back of my neck. Then the truck roared to life. I didn't start it. I wasn't even inside yet. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the creature as it lunged for me. It froze in the bright beams, its skin pale and stretched, its face a featureless mask. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then it shrieked, a sound so high and sharp, it felt like needles stabbing into my ears, and darted back toward the barn. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself into the truck, slammed the door, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying in my wake. In the rearview mirror, I saw the farmhouse lights flicker and die, one by one, until only the lantern remained, glowing faintly on the porch. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. I told my friends I'd lost the bet, made up some story about the place being too creepy to stay the whole night. I didn't mention the lantern, the footsteps, or the thing in the barn. I should have forgotten about it. Moved on. But last night, I woke up to find a faint yellow glow in my bedroom. The lantern was on my dresser. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The lantern sat on my dresser, its faint yellow flame steady and unmoving, the same lantern I left behind at Widow's Creek. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that I was still out there on the farm, and all of this was a fever dream, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But when dawn broke, the light of the flame didn't dim. It stayed just as bright, a constant reminder that whatever followed me home wasn't leaving. I couldn't stay in the house. I packed what I could and drove. No destination in mind, just miles of asphalt and endless trees. The morning air was crisp, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there, the pale, stretched face of whatever came out of that barn. But I was alone, for now. I checked into a motel on the edge of a neighboring town, telling myself this was temporary, that I could figure out what to do next once I got some sleep. But when I opened the room door, my stomach dropped. The lantern was waiting for me on the bedside table. Its flame burned just as steady, casting that sickly yellow glow. I stepped back, leaving the door open, hoping some part of me was imagining it. But when I blinked, it was still there. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room, expecting it to shatter, to douse that damn flame for good. But it didn't break. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud, the flame undisturbed. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They came from above me, faint and deliberate, just like they had in the farmhouse. My heart hammered as the sound moved across the ceiling, stopping directly above where I stood. A shadow fell over the bed. It stretched impossibly tall, the head cocked at that same unnatural angle. It wasn't cast by me. It was waiting. I fled the motel. There was no plan now, just an overwhelming need to keep moving. I drove for hours, the highway blurring into a gray monotony. The lantern didn't appear in the car, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd left it behind. Maybe it was over. Then the radio crackled to life. At first it was static, but slowly I started to hear a voice, a low, garbled whisper, almost like it was trying to speak, but couldn't quite form words. I turned the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the air vents now, from the faint hum of the engine. Widow? Waiting? My grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as bone. The voice was clearer now, repeating those same words over and over. Widow, waiting, widow, waiting. It was nearly sunset when the truck broke down. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on a stretch of empty road. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. When I finally got out, the landscape around me was unfamiliar. Flat fields stretched out on either side of the road, broken only by the silhouette of a barn in the distance. My blood ran cold. It was Widow's Creek. The truck wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. I was trapped, and I knew I wasn't alone. The lantern was on the hood of the truck now, its light flickering weakly in the dusk. The footsteps started again. They were closer this time, moving with purpose, circling the truck. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. My flashlight barely cut through the growing darkness, but I swept it in frantic arcs, trying to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the fields, their movements slow and jerky. They were tall and thin, their bodies stretched unnaturally, their faces blank slates of pale skin. Dozens of them all converging on the truck. I grabbed the lantern off the hood without thinking, clutching it like it might somehow protect me. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the light. The flame flared brighter, and for a moment, they hesitated. "Leave!" I screamed, holding the lantern high. The figures shrank back, their forms dissolving into the shadows. But the moment didn't last. The flame sputtered, growing dimmer, and they began to move again. Faster this time, closing the distance with unnatural speed. I don't remember how I made it back to the farmhouse, only that I did. The lantern led me, its glow flickering through the dark, guiding me past the barn and into the house. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it, though I knew it wouldn't keep them out. The figures were at the windows now, their faces pressed against the glass. The lantern sat on the table where I'd first found it, its flame burning weakly. And then it spoke. "Burn it," the voice whispered, faint and hollow. end it. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the floor. The oil spilled out, catching fire immediately. The flames spread fast, consuming the room, the walls, everything. The figures at the windows screamed, their cries high and inhuman, and then they were gone. I ran. The farmhouse burned behind me, a towering inferno that lit up the night. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the house had collapsed in on itself, the flames dying down to embers. I don't know what I unleashed that night, or if I stopped it. The lantern was gone, but its light still haunts me. Sometimes when the nights are quiet and the air is still, I catch a faint yellow glow out of the corner of my eye, and I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back. The night started like any other, quiet, uneventful, with a slight chill in the air as the moon hung high over the sprawling farmland. I'd agreed to watch over my friend's farm while he and his wife took a rare weekend off. The place was massive, bordered by dense woods on one side and endless cornfields on the other. I was promised nothing more than a cozy guest room and some peace. Instead, I got something I'll never forget. By midnight, the house was silent. The livestock, a handful of cows and a stubborn old mule, were already settled in the barn. I'd finished my last round through the property, locked the doors, and double-checked the generator since the area was notorious for power outages. All seemed fine. I was halfway into a second beer, flipping channels on an old TV in the living room, when I heard it. A sharp metallic asterisk, clank asterisk, like something striking the barn door. My first thought was, raccoons. They're bold out here. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The yard stretched out into shadows, the barn standing 100 yards from the house, just beyond the motion-activated light's reach. As I stepped closer, the light snapped on. My stomach dropped. The barn door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Raccoons don't do that, I muttered to myself. The beam from my flashlight cut through the dark as I stepped inside. The barn smelled of hay and earth, familiar but strangely oppressive that night. The cows were agitated, shifting nervously in their pens, their eyes reflecting the light with unnatural brightness. The mule, usually indifferent to everything, let out a low, uneasy bray from the back corner. "Hello?" I called out, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped whoever, or whatever, was there would just leave if they heard me. No response. Just the sound of animals shifting and the faint creak of the barn's wooden beams. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt floor. Bare, human-like prints. But they were wrong. The toes were too long, almost clawed, and the stride was unnatural, too far apart, like whoever made them was crawling or bounding rather than walking. I followed the tracks to the far corner of the barn, where the mule stood trembling, its ears pinned back. Beyond it was the old ladder that led up to the hayloft. The prints stopped there, but the mule's reaction told me whatever it was hadn't just disappeared. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed to leave, to lock the barn, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I ignored it, whatever was lurking up there wouldn't stay contained. I climbed the ladder slowly, the wooden rungs creaking under my weight. My flashlight swept across the hayloft. It was empty at first glance, just piles of straw and old tools gathering dust. Then I noticed something odd. In the far corner, where the moonlight filtered through the slats, the hay was matted down, like something had been lying there, and next to it, scratch marks, long, deep grooves in the wood, as if made by claws. That's when I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from above me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The barn had no second story, just the roof beams overhead. Slowly, I tilted the flashlight upward. Something was there, crouched among the beams, its pale limbs impossibly thin and long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but they were too big, too human. It moved suddenly, skittering along the beams like a spider, the clicking sound growing louder as its claws scraped against the wood. I don't remember climbing down. 1 second, I was staring at it, and the next, I was sprinting toward the house, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard, it hurt. The house felt wrong now, like it wasn't safe anymore. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Not unusual for the area, but it felt deliberate. Then, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear it now. The faint asterisk, click, click, click asterisk of claws on the porch outside. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. I moved as quietly as I could, grabbing the only weapon I could find, a rusty hatchet from the fireplace tools. The sound moved to the side of the house, then the back, as if it was circling, testing the walls. Then came the worst sound yet, the creak of a window sliding open upstairs. It was in the house. My mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide that it wouldn't find me. The only option was to face it. Hatchet in hand, I crept up the stairs, every step feeling like it could be my last. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the guest room door slightly ajar. The faint moonlight spilling in showed the curtains fluttering. The window was wide open. The clicking had stopped. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, but the bedspread was disturbed. Claw marks raked across the headboard. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I backed out of the room. That's when I felt it. Hot breath against my neck. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly. It caught something, the blade sinking in with a wet asterisk thunk asterisk. A screech filled the air, high-pitched and inhuman. The creature recoiled, its long limbs thrashing as it tried to pull away. I saw it clearly for the first time, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones, its face a grotesque mimicry of human features, twisted into something predatory. I didn't stop swinging until it stopped moving. When the sun rose, I buried what was left of it in the woods. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. My friend's farm looks peaceful in the daylight, but I'll never stay there again. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some places aren't meant to be guarded, alone. A week after that night, I got a call from my friend. He thanked me for watching the farm and casually asked if I noticed anything strange while I was there. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what happened without sounding insane? Instead of answering directly, I asked why he'd asked. His tone shifted, less casual, more guarded. Well, he began. We've been having issues for a while. Strange sounds in the barn, missing animals. Thought maybe it was coyotes or feral dogs. But the footprints we've found don't match anything we know. The neighbors have seen things near the woods. Things? I asked, my voice tight. Yeah, like figures. Too tall, too thin, running on all fours. One of the neighbors swears it looked right at him. They won't come near the property now. He laughed nervously. Honestly, I figured it was just their imagination, until we started losing livestock. I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse quickening. Why didn't you tell me this before I stayed there? There was a long pause. I didn't want to scare you off. Besides, we figured it was just animals. Nothing that'd bother a person, you know? I didn't respond. My thoughts were spiraling back to that night, to the thing in the barn, its impossible limbs, the way it moved, how it felt too smart, too aware. "Hey," he added, "we're putting the place up for sale. The wife and I decided it's not worth the stress. Whoever buys it can deal with whatever's out there." That was the last time I heard from him. The farm sold within a month, and I heard the new owners moved in without issue. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I tried to convince myself that whatever I'd faced that night was gone, that maybe I'd killed it. But deep down, I knew better. About 3 months later, I was back in the city, starting to feel normal again. Then one evening, as I was locking up my apartment for the night, I heard it. A faint asterisk, click, 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 asterisk, from somewhere in the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, staring at the peephole in my door, expecting to see something staring back. But when I finally worked up the courage to look, the hallway was empty. The sound stopped. But now, every night when it's quiet, I listen for it. Sometimes I think I hear it, just at the edge of perception. A soft, rhythmic asterisk, click, 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 asterisk, like claws on wood, like it's waiting for me. And I know one thing for sure. Whatever it is, it doesn't stay on the farm. I've never told anyone this before, mostly because I know no one would believe me. And honestly, I don't know if I believe it myself. But I've been haunted by it ever since. Maybe if I write it down, I can let it go. This happened a few years ago. I was doing a solo road trip through the Midwest. I'd planned it as a way to clear my head after a messy breakup. I was hitting every weird roadside attraction I could find. Giant fiberglass animals, tiny museums, old diners. You know, Americana at its quirkiest. It was the middle of nowhere, somewhere on a back road in South Dakota, when my car started making that sound. You know the one. The grinding that makes your stomach drop because you know it's bad. The "I'm about to be stranded" sound. I pulled over to the side of the road. Nothing but flat fields in every direction. Not a single car had passed me in hours. Cell service? Forget it. I popped the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking at. Just a steaming, hissing mess. And then, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I saw it. A beat-up old RV trundling toward me, rattling like it was held together with duct tape and prayer. I waved it down, figuring whoever was inside might have a phone or at least a toolbox. The RV stopped a few feet ahead of my car. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with stringy hair and a faded denim jacket. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, trying not to let the growing unease show on my face. "Car broke down. Got any tools?" He tilted his head, like he was considering. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on a crocodile before it snapped its jaws shut. "I got tools," he said. "Why don't you come inside? Safer than waiting out here in the dark." There was something off about him, but I figured I didn't have much of a choice. I followed him up the rickety steps into the RV. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like meat left out in the sun too long. Inside, it was cluttered. Piles of dirty clothes, tools scattered everywhere, and jars. Lots of jars, all lined up on shelves. Each one was filled with a murky liquid, and floating inside were things. I couldn't tell what they were, but some looked like animal parts. Others, not so much. He rummaged through a drawer, pulling out wrenches and pliers. "What brings you out here?" he asked over his shoulder. "Just a road trip," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled. Not many folks come down this road, not unless they're lost or looking for something. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I decided I'd grab whatever tools he handed me and get out of there as fast as possible. But before I could say anything, he turned to me, holding a massive wrench. "You ever seen something you can't explain?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "What do you mean?" I asked, backing toward the door. "You know," he said, gesturing to the jars. "Things that don't belong in this world." I glanced at the jars again. One of them had what looked like a human hand inside, only it had too many fingers, and the skin was an unnatural, waxy yellow. "I think I should get back to my car," I said, trying to sound casual, but he blocked the door. "What's the rush? Night's coming, and out here when it gets dark, that's when they come out." "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. He grinned again, wider this time. "The ones that aren't supposed to be here. The ones that used to be human." I pushed past him and stumbled out of the RV, dropping the wrench in the process. I ran back to my car, not daring to look behind me. The engine was still dead, but I didn't care. I locked the doors and sat there, my hands shaking on the wheel. That's when I saw it. Something was moving in the fields. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but then I realized it was standing upright. Tall, too tall, with long, gangly arms that hung almost to the ground. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I wasn't alone. There were more of them, emerging from the tall grass, moving toward the RV, toward me. The man stepped out of the RV, holding something in his hands, a jar, glowing faintly with that same sickly light as their eyes. He held it up, and the creatures stopped. They tilted their heads, watching him, like they were waiting for something. I don't know what happened next. I closed my eyes, praying they wouldn't notice me. When I opened them, the man and the creatures were gone. The RV was still there, its door swinging in the breeze. But the man, the things, gone. I spent the night in my car, too scared to move. By morning, the RV was gone too. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. All I know is, if you're ever driving through South Dakota and your car breaks down, don't accept help from anyone. And if you see something moving in the fields after dark, don't look too closely. I didn't stick around to find out what else might be lurking. As soon as the sun crested the horizon, I jumped out of the car and started walking, following the road in the direction I'd come from. The air felt heavy, like the earth itself wanted to hold me in place, but I forced myself to keep moving. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that RV rumbling after me, or those things slinking through the fields. I must have walked for hours before I saw it. A gas station. It looked ancient, with peeling paint and a sign that barely hung onto its rusted frame. But it was a lifeline. I broke into a jog, relief flooding my chest. The old man behind the counter didn't even look up when I came in, out of breath and wild-eyed. His face was weathered, his skin a deep tan from years under the sun, and he wore a trucker cap pulled low over his forehead. "Morning," he said, chewing on a toothpick. His tone was calm, disinterested, like he saw people like me every day. "My car broke down," I blurted out. "Can I use your phone?" The man squinted at me, then slowly reached under the counter, pulling out an ancient rotary phone. "No cell service out here. Use this." I dialed a tow truck company, stammering out my location as best I could. They told me it'd take a couple of hours to get someone out there. Fine. I could wait. As I hung up, the old man was watching me. His gaze was sharp now, the kind of look that felt like it could peel away your skin to see what was underneath. You come down from the East Road? He asked, voice low. I nodded. See anything strange? I hesitated, not sure how to answer. What do you mean? He leaned forward, elbows on the counter. I mean, did you see them? I froze. My stomach turned to ice. The man sighed and shook his head. You're lucky you made it here. Most folks don't. Not when they're out after dark. What are they? I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, walked over to the window, and peered out at the empty road. A long time ago, this place wasn't just farmland. There was something here, something bad. The old folks called it the Hollow, said it was a place where the world didn't sit right, where the line between this world and other things was thin. He turned back to me, his face grim. People built over it, figured they could just bury it and move on. But you can't bury something like that. It stays. It waits. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The man in the RV, does he have something to do with it? The old man's eyes darkened. If you saw him, you're lucky you got away. He's not a man, not anymore. I wanted to ask more, but the distant rumble of an engine cut me off. The tow truck pulled into the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust. I thanked the old man and hurried out, eager to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever had happened out there. The tow truck driver was chatty at first, but when I told him where my car had broken down, he went quiet. He didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. We got back to the nearest town, and I left my car at a local mechanic. I thought about telling someone, maybe the cops, but what would I even say? That I'd seen monsters in a field, that a man with jars full of nightmares had invited me into his RV. No one would believe me. I bought a bus ticket back home and didn't look back. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in the fields, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And every time, my chest tightens, and I grip the wheel a little harder. I don't take back roads anymore. I don't stop for strangers. And I never, ever look too closely at what might be watching from the dark. Because I know, deep down, that the Hollow is still out there, and some roads should never be traveled. The tires hummed against the asphalt as I drove down the endless stretch of highway, a black ribbon cutting through the vast desert. I was on the third day of my road trip, a solo journey I planned to clear my head and escape the monotony of my 9-to-5. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a cathartic drive through America's forgotten backroads, listening to music and collecting memories. But everything changed that night. I had just passed a rusted green sign reading Sandorian, 30 miles, when I noticed the gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. The needle was almost kissing the E, and my GPS, though barely functional in the desert, showed no gas stations nearby. I cursed under my breath and leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, a sign of civilization. It wasn't a gas station. The glow belonged to an old diner, sitting at the edge of nowhere. Its neon sign flickered, spelling "Dine and Shine" in a dull orange light. Relief flooded through me. At least it was a place to stop, ask for directions, and maybe buy a cup of coffee while I planned my next move. I pulled into the gravel lot, my headlights sweeping across a couple of dusty trucks and an old station wagon. The diner looked as tired as the vehicles parked outside. A bell jingled above the door as I entered, and I was hit with the smell of stale grease and coffee, so burnt it seemed aggressive. The diner was empty except for the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and a single customer sitting at the far corner booth. The man didn't look up as I walked in, his face obscured by a hood. I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and explained my gas situation to the waitress. She nodded, lips pressed tight, and pointed to an old payphone by the restrooms. "You can call Manny," she said. "He's got a gas can and lives nearby. Charges a bit extra for the trouble, though." I thanked her, but before I could move, the hooded man turned his head slightly in my direction. His eyes glinted like wet asphalt in the dim light. I froze. "Don't bother," he said softly. His voice was low and gravelly. "You won't make it to Sandorian tonight." I chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the chill that ran down my spine. "Why's that?" I asked. The man leaned back, the shadows swallowing his face again. "You just won't?" The waitress shot him a sharp look, muttered something under her breath, and walked to the back kitchen, leaving me alone in the awkward silence. I glanced at the man's booth. Empty plates were stacked neatly in front of him, but his hands were out of sight beneath the table. He was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. I decided to take my chances and called Manny. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Dine and Shine Diner? I'll be there in 20. Don't go anywhere." When I returned to my seat, the hooded man was gone. The door hadn't jingled. I turned to the waitress, who had just come back from the kitchen. "Where'd the guy go?" She frowned. "What guy?" I stared at her, my skin prickling. "The guy in the corner booth. Hooded sweatshirt, he..." She cut me off. "We don't get many visitors here this time of night. You're the only one who's come in." I glanced at the corner booth again. The plates were gone. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. I decided to wait outside for Manny. The desert was eerily quiet. No wind, no distant hum of wildlife, just the sound of my own breathing and the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign. The stars were brilliant overhead, but even their beauty couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching on the gravel behind the diner. I turned quickly, expecting to see Manny, or maybe the hooded man. There was no one. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the building slowly, deliberately. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps paused. Then they started again, faster this time. They were coming toward me. I backed up against my car, heart pounding, fumbling for my keys. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just around the corner of the diner. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one swift motion. A shadow moved at the edge of my headlights. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something from a fever dream. It didn't move like a person, more like a marionette with broken strings. And then it stopped, standing just at the edge of the light, as if it knew the glow was a barrier it couldn't cross. I didn't wait to find out. I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered. The shadow moved closer. I twisted the key again, praying, pleading. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. My heart was racing as I sped down the empty highway, the diner's neon sign shrinking in my rearview mirror. But as I drove, something gnawed at me. The man's words in the diner. "You won't make it to Sandorian tonight." The thought struck me like a hammer. He hadn't said I couldn't. He said I wouldn't. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. That's when I saw it. The shadow wasn't at the diner anymore. It was in my back seat. I slammed on the brakes so hard, the tires screeched, sending the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the desolate highway. My breathing was erratic, my chest heaving like I'd just sprinted a mile. The rearview mirror quivered as the car settled, but the shadow in the back seat didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My eyes locked on the mirror, sweat dripping down my temple. The shadow was just there. A formless dark mass that seemed to pulse and shift like smoke caught in a vacuum. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer. No movement. Just silence. Gathering every ounce of courage I didn't think I had, I slowly turned my head. The back seat was empty. Relief rushed over me so violently that I almost laughed. Almost. I straightened in my seat, rubbed my temples, and tried to shake off the terror as the absurdity of it all settled in. Sleep deprivation, I thought, my mind playing tricks on me. I put the car back into gear and continued driving. The headlights pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but endless road and desert, stretching into oblivion. Yet, no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy thing again. But it was just me, and the yawning void of the highway behind me. Then the radio crackled. The static came out of nowhere, cutting through the silence like a razor. I hadn't even realized the radio was on, and when I reached to turn it off, a voice emerged. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Turn around." My blood froze. I ripped the knob off the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, the static more aggressive. "Turn around." The dashboard lights flickered, and the car shuddered, as if something massive had latched onto it. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, and I sped down the highway, adrenaline coursing through me. And then the headlights died. Darkness swallowed the car whole. I couldn't see the road, the desert, or even my own hands gripping the steering wheel. The world dissolved into pitch black, and the only sound was the frantic thrum of my heart. "Turn around," the voice whispered again, so close it felt like it was coming from the passenger seat. I couldn't help myself. I turned. What I saw wasn't human. A pair of eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing a sickly yellow, like lanterns in a fog. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They were fixed on me with an intensity that felt like it could peel back my skin and see everything beneath. Its face was wrong, shifting and changing, like trying to hold water in your hands. At one moment, it had a gaping, toothy grin. The next, its mouth was stretched impossibly wide, as if it could swallow the car whole. And those eyes, they never moved, never faltered. They burned into me, drilling into my mind, paralyzing me. "Why are you running?" it asked, its voice overlapping with itself, both a whisper and a roar. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was locked, frozen in terror. The creature's hand, or what passed for a hand, reached out. Long skeletal fingers stretched toward me, their tips curling like talons. I thought this was it, that I was done for, that I would die here on this God-forsaken highway, my body never found. But then, the car jerked violently. The headlights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead. I realized I was barreling straight toward a sharp turn. I yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding plummeting into a rocky ravine. The tires screeched, the car swerved, and I came to a stop, my chest heaving, tears streaming down my face. When I looked back to the passenger seat, it was empty. The voice was gone. The static was gone. The road was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The shadow, the eyes, the voice, they were real. I knew it. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my entire body trembling with fear. I couldn't stay on that highway. I had to get to Sandorian, no matter what. I pressed the gas, driving as fast as the car could go without flying off the road. The desert began to change. The air grew colder, the stars above dimmer. The world felt heavier, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. Then I saw it, a sign up ahead. Sandorian, 5 miles. Relief surged through me. I was close. I could make it. But as I passed the sign, something moved in the corner of my eye. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The shadow was back. It wasn't just in the back seat this time. It filled the car, seeping into every corner like an inky mist. The voice returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come here." The car began to spin. I tried to control it, but the wheel was unresponsive. The shadow swirled around me, thick and suffocating. My vision blurred, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of darkness and sound. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was parked at the entrance to Sandorian. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the small abandoned town. My hands were still gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. The shadow was gone. I stepped out of the car, the morning air crisp and quiet. But as I stood there, staring at the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that whatever followed me was still watching, waiting. The road trip was over, but the terror wasn't. I hate long drives at night. There's something about the dark highway stretching endlessly ahead, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights, that gets under my skin. But this trip couldn't wait. My boss had been clear. Either deliver the package to the facility upstate by morning, or don't bother coming in on Monday. So there I was, cruising down an empty interstate at 2 a.m., miles from anywhere. The radio spitting static because even the FM signals seemed too afraid to linger here. My GPS kept glitching, and my phone battery was draining unnaturally fast, despite being plugged in. Not great. It started with a shadow. I first saw it in my rearview mirror, a flicker just beyond the reach of my taillights. At 60 miles per hour, it shouldn't have been possible for anything to move that fast. Yet, there it was. Something humanoid, with limbs too long and angular to belong to a person, darting across the lane behind me. I brushed it off. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. A trick of the light. But then it darted closer, sticking to the shoulder, like it was stalking me. It didn't feel like a hallucination anymore. Still, I kept driving. Slowing down wasn't an option, and there was no way I was pulling over to investigate. Not here. Not in the middle of nowhere. The radio clicked off suddenly. Silence. And that's when the thing hit my car. The impact slammed me forward, and my tires screeched as I veered into the opposite lane, narrowly missing a guardrail. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to control the wheel. What the hell was that? When I stopped the car and stepped out, it was so quiet I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. The back of my car had a huge dent, like something heavy had crashed into it. But there was no debris, no animal carcass, nothing. I scanned the area, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded too loud, too fragile against the oppressive quiet. Something answered. The response came as a whisper. No, not a whisper, a movement. From the edge of the flashlight's beam, something crawled into view. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its body was gaunt and pale, stretched thin over jagged bones, with skin that gleamed unnaturally under the light. It moved low to the ground, its spindly limbs clicking like branches in a storm. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, except for a faint suggestion of eyes, black and sunken deep into the skull. I froze. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it opened its mouth, or rather, It split. A gash ran down the center of its head, peeling back to reveal rows of teeth, jagged and glistening. It let out a sound like metal scraping against stone. I bolted back to my car. As I slammed the door shut, the thing lunged. Its body smacked against my windshield, its claws raking the glass. I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as I sped off, the creature clinging to the hood. It began pounding on the windshield, spiderweb cracks forming under its blows. My heart raced as I swerved, trying to throw it off. But the thing held firm, its mouth gaping wider, that awful screeching sound cutting through the roar of the engine. I saw a turn up ahead, a sharp bend that veered into a dirt road. I didn't think. I cranked the wheel hard and braced myself as the car skidded. The creature lost its grip, flung violently into the ditch, but my relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw it rise. Slowly, its limbs cracked and twisted unnaturally as it stood taller now, towering over the roadside brush, and it was running after me. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the dirt road slowed me down. The car bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, the headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. I could hear it, behind me, gaining. Then up ahead, I saw it. A tunnel. An old, decrepit bridge I hadn't seen on the GPS earlier. I didn't care. It was my only option. The tunnel swallowed me in darkness as I barreled through. My headlights flickered and sputtered, but I kept going, heart pounding. The creature's footsteps faded behind me. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then the lights on my dashboard went out. The engine sputtered. The car rolled to a stop. "No," I whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. I reached for my phone, but it was dead too. The battery inexplicably drained. The silence in the tunnel was suffocating. And then, a sound. A wet, slithering noise, echoing off the tunnel walls. It was here. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, hands shaking, and stepped out of the car. The air felt heavy, oppressive. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I swept the beam around. The creature stood at the far end of the tunnel, only it wasn't alone anymore. Figures emerged from the shadows, their gaunt, pale forms crawling on all fours, their eyeless faces turned toward me in unison. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. They didn't. The first one moved toward me, slow at first, then faster, its claws clicking against the concrete. I swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam did nothing to slow it down. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the tunnel, the creatures chasing me, their guttural screeches bouncing off the walls. I could see the faint glow of moonlight ahead, the tunnel's exit looming closer, but so were they. One of them lunged, claws raking my shoulder. I stumbled, but adrenaline kept me moving. I burst out of the tunnel into the open air, and then, silence. I turned back, expecting to see them still chasing me, but the tunnel was empty. I stood there panting, my shoulder bleeding, heart hammering in my chest. They were gone, or at least, they wouldn't leave the tunnel. I didn't wait to find out why. I staggered to the highway, flagged down a trucker, and left my car, and that place, behind. But the tunnel didn't leave me. When I close my eyes at night, I hear the clicking, the scraping. I see those empty faces, waiting, watching. And sometimes when the room is quiet enough, I think I hear them whispering my name. It started on a call like any other. A dispatch about a disturbance on Lincoln Avenue, a rundown stretch of road I've driven 1,000 times. Routine, I thought. But nothing about that night would be routine. I'm an officer, and my job is to answer calls, no matter how bizarre they might sound. The caller reported screams, frantic footsteps, and what they described as shadows chasing shadows. Dispatch didn't think it sounded credible, but they sent me anyway. Pulling onto Lincoln Avenue at 3 a.m., I slowed to a crawl. The street was empty, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you swear you're hearing whispers. My patrol car's headlights cut through the night, bouncing off the cracked windows of old shops and boarded-up buildings. Then I saw her, a woman sprinting down the middle of the street. She was barefoot, wearing a torn dress, her face twisted in sheer terror. I rolled down my window to call out to her, but before I could, she stopped dead in her tracks, her neck snapping around like she'd heard something I couldn't. She screamed, and that's when I saw it. Something moving behind her. But there was nothing there. Not at first. I jumped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and yelled for her to stop. She ran toward me, sobbing, begging for help. Her words were a jumbled mess, but I caught bits and pieces. It's coming. Invisible. It touched me. Suddenly, she was lifted off the ground. No hands, no wires, nothing. Just her body, rising like a marionette. Her feet dangled in the air as her screams turned to choking gasps. My instinct was to run to her, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had turned solid. I could only watch as her body twisted unnaturally, her arms and legs contorting in directions they shouldn't go. Then, her head snapped. She fell to the pavement in a heap, lifeless. The silence returned, thick and heavy. My radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. I approached her cautiously, flashlight shaking in my grip. Her wide, glassy eyes stared up at me, mouth frozen, mid-scream. There were bruises around her neck, bruises that didn't look like they came from human hands. I called for backup, but deep down, I knew no one would believe what I just saw. As I waited, something caught my eye, a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt. It hovered where the woman had been lifted. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun. The shimmer moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I fired. The bullet hit something. The shimmer flared, twisting like a living thing in pain, then vanished. But the air didn't feel any lighter. Whatever was out there, I knew it wasn't gone. When backup arrived, I didn't tell them everything, just that I found her like that. The official report chalked it up to a hit and run, the case marked unsolved. But I couldn't let it go. That was the night I learned about the Tartarus Archive. But that's a story for another time. For now, just remember, not everything you see on Lincoln Avenue is real, and some things you don't see are more real than you'd like to believe. Weeks passed, but the image of that woman's body didn't leave me. Every night, I drove down Lincoln Avenue on my patrol, scanning for something, anything, to make sense of what happened. But the street stayed empty, a scar on the city's map. I became obsessed. I started digging through old police files, hoping for patterns. Reports of disappearances on Lincoln Avenue dated back decades. Most were written off as runaways, accidents, or unexplainable events buried under paperwork. But some officers, those who worked late shifts on the avenue, had left chilling notes in the margins of reports. Felt watched, couldn't see anything, but it was there. I tried to share my concerns with my partner, but he brushed it off. "Don't go looking for ghosts," he said. But I couldn't stop. One night, my obsession nearly killed me. I was parked on the avenue, engine off, windows cracked. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, a sound, a faint hum, like static, but coming from nowhere. My skin prickled. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and looked around. That's when I saw the shimmer again. It was closer this time, less subtle. The air seemed to bend around it, distorting the empty street like a funhouse mirror. My gut screamed at me to get back in the car, but something about it was magnetic. Against all reason, I stepped closer. The shimmer moved. It was fast, darting down the street like a predator circling its prey. My flashlight flickered, then died. My gun felt useless in my holster. And then, I heard the whisper. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was in my head, but louder than my thoughts. I stumbled back, the whisper growing into a deafening roar. Shapes began to form in the shimmer, elongated limbs, hollow eyes, twisted mouths that didn't belong on any living creature. They flickered in and out of existence, like they couldn't fully cross into our reality. I ran. Back in the car, I threw it into drive and sped off. My radio crackled, voices cutting in and out. "Officer down on Lincoln Avenue." The voice wasn't mine. When I reported the incident, I was met with silence. My captain gave me a long, hard look, then dismissed me for the night. 2 days later, I was called into his office. He handed me a file labeled Classified Tartarus Division. Inside were grainy stills from security footage, the woman I'd seen that night, the shimmer, and other images, faces contorted in terror, bodies suspended in midair, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. He said only one thing: "You didn't see anything." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I combed through the Tartarus file in secret. There were names of other officers, all with eerily similar accounts, all sworn to silence. A few had gone missing. That's when I found the recording. It was from a patrol car on Lincoln Avenue, time-stamped 5 years ago. The dash cam footage showed an empty street at first. Then, the shimmer appeared. The car's engine revved, but the officer never escaped. The shimmer enveloped the vehicle, and within seconds, the footage cut to static. The officer was never found. I requested a transfer the next day. Now, years later, I'm hundreds of miles away from Lincoln Avenue, but the whispers still haunt me. Sometimes when it's quiet, I'll hear the hum, faint but unmistakable. I've learned to ignore it. But if you ever find yourself driving down Lincoln Avenue late at night, and the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. The first time I saw her was through the cracked screen of a police body cam. "Dispatch, suspect unarmed but acting erratic," the officer muttered as his footsteps echoed down the shadowed alley, his breath clouded in the frigid night air. Every exhale, a whisper of tension. The camera bobbed with his steps, capturing the shimmer of frost on the brick walls and the distant glow of streetlights. Then she appeared. She was crouched by a dumpster, her back to the officer, swaying ever so slightly like she was listening to music only she could hear. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her like seaweed on a corpse. The officer called out, his voice steady but sharp. "Ma'am, this is the police. Are you all right?" She didn't turn around. Instead, she raised a single hand, a pale skeletal thing with fingers too long, almost insect-like, and scratched the air. Slowly, methodically, like she was carving something unseen into the fabric of the night. "Ma'am," the officer repeated, more urgent now. He stepped closer, boots crunching on broken glass. That's when she moved. She didn't stand or turn around. She simply twisted. Her neck rotated far beyond what should have been possible, vertebrae cracking like dry twigs, until her face was staring back at the camera. Her eyes were enormous, hollow pits, swallowing the weak beam of the officer's flashlight. And her mouth, God, her mouth, stretched into a grin that could split a human skull. The body cam glitched. For a moment, the screen was static, the audio a shrill, grating scream. When the feed returned, the alley was empty. The woman was gone. "Officer Monroe, what's your status?" Dispatch buzzed, but Monroe wasn't responding. His body cam showed nothing but the open alley now, the flashlight beam trembling as it panned across damp brick walls. Then, with a wet, guttural crunch, the camera fell sideways. The last thing it captured before going dark was a streak of blood pooling into the frost. I shouldn't have seen that footage, but I did. And now she's found me. For 3 days after seeing that footage, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow caught in the corner of my eye felt alive, as if it carried the echo of her grin. Monroe's body was never found. The official report chalked it up to gang violence in the area, but I knew better. That thing, whatever it was, had taken him. I work in law enforcement too, just not on the front lines. My job was to review body cam footage for ongoing investigations, compiling evidence for court cases. After Monroe's footage, I told myself I'd misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But the night after I filed the footage, I got a message in my inbox. Unreviewed Incident 1127 code, redacted. It was flagged for immediate review, a case assigned to me, and only me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. No one spoke to me about it. No directives came through, just the video file. I shouldn't have clicked on it, but I did. This wasn't from Monroe's district. The footage came from across the city, 3 nights after his disappearance. It showed 2 officers responding to a break-in at a derelict industrial warehouse. Their body cams revealed the scene: rusted machines coated in dust, walls lined with graffiti, and corridors that seemed to stretch forever into the dark. "Anyone here? Show yourself," one officer barked, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. His partner covered his 6, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. And then they heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, barely audible. A child's giggle. But as they moved deeper, it grew louder, distorted, the pitch warping until it sounded less like laughter and more like the twisted cries of something mocking human joy. "Cut the crap," the second officer shouted. "This is your last warning." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness around them. That's when the flashlight beams caught movement. Something darted between the rusted machines, too fast to track. The officers shouted, raising their weapons, but it was no use. The thing emerged, not running, but crawling, limbs too long, joints bending the wrong way. It skittered toward them with impossible speed, its hollow eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. One officer fired. The gunshots echoed, deafening in the emptiness. The creature stopped, crouched on all fours, and cocked its head. It didn't bleed. It didn't fall. It simply stared, grinning that same skull-splitting grin. Then it lunged. The camera feed erupted into chaos. Flashes of limbs, screams, static. The footage ended abruptly. I shut my laptop, heart pounding. My apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. Too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint scratching noise. At first I thought it was coming from the walls, maybe rats or the old pipes. But as I sat there frozen, I realized it wasn't the walls. It was my window. I turned slowly. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the silhouette behind them. Something tall, with fingers too long, was tracing patterns in the glass. Slowly, methodically. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, staring at that shadow. Minutes. Hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. 911? What's your emergency? "There's someone outside my window," I whispered. "Can you describe them?" The scratching stopped. The blinds fluttered, as if touched by a faint breeze. Then slowly, they began to part. "No," I stammered. No. Sir, are you there? Sir?" It was her. That face. That impossible grin. Her hollow eyes bore into mine as she pressed her palms flat against the glass, her nails scraping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She leaned closer, her grin widening, until the corners of her mouth began to tear. I dropped the phone. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was in my living room. The next I was sprinting down the fire escape, barefoot and half-dressed, into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest precinct, pounding on the doors like a lunatic. When they finally let me in, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. The footage from Monroe's body cam, gone. The unreviewed file, deleted from the system. They pulled up my personnel file and flagged me for mental health evaluation. I quit the next day. Now I'm writing this from a motel on the edge of town, lights blazing, a chair propped against the door. I don't think it'll matter. Wherever I go, she'll find me. If you're reading this and you work with police footage, take my advice. Don't click on anything marked redacted. And if you ever hear laughter in the dark, run. Don't look back, because no matter how fast you run, she'll be faster. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed restricted, but something about the timing felt off. I was home alone, sprawled on the couch with a half-empty beer and some late-night TV reruns. The sound of the phone ringing in the quiet room was like a scream. I hesitated but answered anyway. "Hello?" A voice, frantic and low, whispered, "Are you home? Lock your doors. Now." I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. "Who is this?" The line clicked dead. Normally I'd brush it off as a prank call or some weirdo, but the tone, that panicked edge, stuck with me. I stood up, every creak of the floor making me flinch, and went to the front door. It was already locked, but I double-checked. Windows, secure, back door, latched tight, satisfied. I sat back down, laughing nervously to myself. Then I saw the police cruiser pull into my driveway. The patrol car's lights weren't flashing, but its mere presence was enough to make my stomach churn. A tall officer stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the dim porch light. He knocked twice, and I debated for half a second whether to open it. "Mister?" His voice carried through the door. I answered cautiously, opening it just enough to meet his eyes. "Yeah? Something wrong?" "We received a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but something in his eyes. It wasn't just concern. It was fear. "Have you seen or heard anything unusual tonight?" Well, I got a weird phone call a few minutes ago," I admitted. "Told me to lock my doors." The officer nodded, his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun. "May I come in?" Something in me screamed not to let him, but he was a cop. What else could I do? "Yeah, sure." As soon as he stepped in, I noticed the tension in his shoulders. He was scanning the room like he expected someone or something to leap out at any moment. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to mask my growing unease. He hesitated, then motioned toward the living room. "Can we sit? I'll explain everything." We sat. He didn't take off his hat, didn't relax. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and lowered his voice. "There's been an incident nearby. I need to ask. Have you noticed anything strange in the past week? People following you? Strange vehicles parked outside?" My heart skipped a beat. "No, nothing like that. What kind of incident are we talking about?" He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "A break-in. But it's more complicated than that. The suspect might still be in the area." I felt the weight of his words settle like a lead blanket. Before I could press for details, the police radio clipped to his shoulder crackled to life. Unit 47, report. Suspect confirmed near Elm and 3rd. Proceed with caution. All units advised. The officer shot up, his hand immediately gripping his gun. Stay here, he ordered. Lock the door behind me. Don't answer for anyone but the police. And just like that, he was gone, the red and blue glow of his cruiser fading down the street. I locked the door as he instructed, but the silence that followed was unbearable. That's when I noticed something. The basement door. It was slightly ajar. I stared at the basement door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Positive. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to call the officer back, but my phone sat uselessly on the coffee table. I wasn't even sure I could move. Then came the sound. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight on the wooden basement steps. I backed away instinctively, eyes locked on the gap, where the door hung slightly open. The living room suddenly felt suffocating. Every shadow stretched longer, every sound amplified. I grabbed the nearest thing resembling a weapon, a heavy floor lamp, and inched closer to the door. Hello? My voice barely broke a whisper. Idiotic. As if I wanted a reply. The silence was deafening. Then came a slow, scraping noise, like metal dragging against the wall. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Look, I stammered. I don't know who's down there, but the cops are already here. They're coming back any second. Nothing. And then, almost imperceptibly, I saw it. A flash of movement low to the ground, at the edge of the basement's shadows. I stepped back, holding the lamp like a bat, and shouted, I'm armed. Come out now. The basement door slammed shut. Hard. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't have time to think. My brain screamed run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then the floor lamp's light flickered and died, plunging the room into a thick, oppressive darkness. And that's when the doorknob started to turn. The logical part of my brain was gone, overtaken by pure primal fear. I bolted for the kitchen, skidding on the tile as I grabbed the biggest knife I could find. The house was silent again. But I knew I wasn't alone. I tried to force my trembling fingers to dial 911, but the phone buzzed with a new notification. A single text message, get out. The number was restricted. As if on cue, the basement door creaked open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the stairs. I pressed myself against the far wall of the kitchen, knife in hand, when I saw him step into view. It wasn't the cop. The man was tall and wiry, his face obscured by some kind of crude mask, a burlap sack with slits for eyes. He held a crowbar in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against the wall as he stepped into the living room. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. Come out now, and I'll make it quick. I froze, barely breathing, as he scanned the room. His head tilted, and he sniffed the air like a predator. Then he turned, heading for the hallway that led to the kitchen. I wasn't going to wait for him to find me. As soon as his back was turned, I bolted. I sprinted through the side door into the yard, knife still clutched in my hand. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the street, praying the officer's cruiser would still be close. Instead, I saw two figures standing in the shadows near the curb. Help! I screamed, desperate, running toward them. They stepped into the light. It was the officer. But standing next to him was another man, wearing a matching police uniform. Same height, same build, same badge. My brain struggled to process it, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "What?" The officer I'd let into my house earlier raised his gun. On the ground, now. I didn't move. Couldn't. The other officer, the real one, looked just as confused as I felt. He put a hand on his holster, his expression sharp. "What's going on here?" The man with the gun didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the house, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. The tiniest shift in his demeanor. Panic. He wasn't a cop. "Drop the gun," the second officer barked, stepping forward. And then, chaos. The fake cop turned and bolted, disappearing into the dark. The real officer chased him, shouting into his radio for backup. I stood there trembling, clutching my knife, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Behind me, from the open basement door, came a low, guttural laugh. I didn't wait. I ran. The real police arrived minutes later. They searched the house, the basement, the yard, but whoever or whatever had been there was gone. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. The officer who'd chased the imposter returned, his face pale. He told me the man had vanished into the woods, leaving behind a discarded mask and the empty shell of a police cruiser. "That guy in your house?" the officer said, his voice grave. "He's been posing as law enforcement for months, breaking in, stalking people. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. That word stuck with me. I moved out of that house the next day, left the city altogether. But every night I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the creak of the basement stairs. And sometimes, when my phone buzzes in the dark, I still see those words, "Get out." I didn't believe the warnings at first. I mean, who listens to whispers about a desolate highway anyway? But this wasn't just any road. It was Ridgeway Stretch, a winding path through the middle of nowhere. My night shift had just ended, and my brain was buzzing too much for a straight route home. Something about the idea of open roads under a pitch-black sky seemed soothing. I should have stayed on the main road. It started harmless enough. The hum of my car, the faint rhythm of late-night radio, and the vast emptiness stretching ahead. But something felt off. The moon, which had been full and bright, vanished behind clouds, plunging the world into a darkness so thick my headlights barely made a dent. Then I saw it. A figure on the side of the road, just standing there. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood still like they were carved out of the darkness itself. Something about the way they leaned slightly forward felt wrong, like gravity was holding them in place unnaturally. My instinct screamed, "Keep driving." So I did. But as my car rolled past, the headlights flickered, and I swear I saw the figure twist its head to watch me. Only there were no eyes, just hollow pits. My chest tightened, and I floored the gas pedal. The car roared forward, the speedometer climbing past 70, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The road felt endless, curving in ways it hadn't before, twisting like a serpent. My GPS blinked out, replacing my destination with static. That's when the radio crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, seeped through the speakers. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I nearly swerved off the road as the voice hissed through the car's speakers. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was rattling my ribs. The radio wasn't even turned on. I'd switched it off minutes ago, fed up with static. But here it was, alive and taunting me. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Long shift, dark road, adrenaline. Classic ingredients for a good scare. That's all it was. At least, That's what I told myself until my headlights caught movement up ahead. Something darted across the road, low and fast, like an animal. I slammed the brakes hard, skidding to a stop. The silence afterward was deafening. My car idled in the middle of the stretch, headlights illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and the distant shimmer of mist. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from above. I froze, staring at the roof of the car. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like nails scratching at metal. My breath hitched as I glanced at the rearview mirror. The interior was pitch black, but for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind me, a subtle shift of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Gripping the wheel tighter, I slammed the car into gear and sped off. The tapping stopped instantly, but the relief didn't last. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Look in the mirror. I didn't want to. God help me, I didn't want to. But my eyes betrayed me, flickering up to the rear view. The shadow was back, but now it had form. A figure hunched low, its head almost brushing the roof. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it staring at me, the weight of its presence pressing down on my chest. No, I whispered, shaking my head, as if denying it could make it disappear. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The engine whined, the car shuddering as it hit 90, then 100. The road narrowed, trees closing in like a tunnel, their branches clawing at the sides of my car. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, its presence growing heavier with each passing second. Then, in a voice that sounded like rusted metal scraping glass, it whispered, "You can't outrun it." I screamed, swerving wildly. The car clipped something, a signpost or maybe a guardrail, and spun out. Time slowed as the world flipped. Metal groaned, glass shattered, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I was going to die. But I didn't. When the car finally stopped rolling, I was upside down, hanging by the seatbelt. Blood dripped from a gash on my forehead, my breaths shallow and rapid. The silence was suffocating. I fumbled with the buckle, crashing down onto the cracked windshield. Every muscle in my body screamed as I crawled out of the wreckage. The night was eerily calm. My car lay in a mangled heap, steam hissing from the engine. The road was gone. I wasn't on Ridgway Stretch anymore. I wasn't anywhere. Around me was an endless expanse of fog, shifting like it was alive. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, growing closer. I turned, my legs trembling, and saw the figure emerge from the mist. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "What do you want?" I screamed, backing away. It didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with a hand that wasn't a hand. It was more like a claw, made of shadows. And then, it spoke. "You left the road. Now you belong to me." I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The clock read 7:06 a.m. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, warm and familiar. It was just a nightmare, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But as I sat up, my body aching, I realized something was wrong. The clothes I was wearing were the same ones from the night before, torn and stained with blood. My car keys were still in my pocket, sticky with grime, and etched into the palm of my hand, as if burned there, were 3 words: "Don't come back." I haven't driven at night since, and if you're ever tempted to take Ridgway Stretch for a shortcut, let me save you the trouble. Whatever's out there, it doesn't like visitors. The highway was empty, except for my old sedan cutting through the cold, humid night. The yellow lines on the asphalt blurred as I sped up. my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Every so often, my headlights would catch the silhouette of a road sign or an old skeletal tree, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the cracked pavement. I shouldn't have taken that detour. It started as a routine trip home. Work had bled into the late hours, and I'd left the office with nothing on my mind but getting back to bed. The regular route was closed, some roadwork or an accident. I didn't pay attention. My GPS offered an alternative, a back road that wound through what looked like endless farmland and forest. At first, the dark quiet was soothing, almost peaceful. But then I noticed something unsettling, a shape in the rearview mirror, a light, faint at first, blinking intermittently far behind me. I slowed down, expecting it to vanish like a trick of the eye, but it didn't. It grew stronger, steadier, a single glaring white orb bouncing over the road, speeding closer. At the next intersection, I turned off without hesitation, tires screeching against the asphalt. The road narrowed, trees crowding in on either side, and the light disappeared. I let out a shaky breath. Probably just another driver, I told myself. A farmer or a trucker, out late. That's when the radio crackled. It was off. I was sure of it. Off and silent, like it had been all night. But now it hissed, faint voices slipping in and out of static. I glanced at the dashboard, confused, and almost didn't notice the figure in the road until it was too late. It appeared so suddenly, my chest tightened. A man stood directly in my path, his hand raised like he was signaling me to stop. I slammed the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. Heart pounding, I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. The man was pale, unnaturally so, his face hollow and his clothes rumpled. He didn't look homeless, though, or drunk, more like something misplaced. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him. My gut told me to drive, but curiosity won. I cracked the window. "What are you doing out here?" I called, my voice shaking more than I liked. The man's lips stopped moving, his head tilted, neck bending in an unnatural angle. Then, in a voice as clear as if he were sitting beside me, he whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Every instinct screamed to press the gas and go, but my body froze. It wasn't just fear. It was something heavier, like the air had thickened, rooting me to the spot. Then the man moved, not toward me, backward. His feet shuffled awkwardly as he retreated into the shadows, his figure melting into the trees. The radio hissed louder now, the static broken by faint guttural sounds that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Before I could act, the light reappeared in my rearview mirror. This time it wasn't distant. It flooded the inside of my car, so bright it washed out the world outside. My foot found the pedal, and I sped off, the light chasing me like a predator. I floored the gas pedal, the old sedan groaning as it sped down the winding road. The blinding light in my rearview mirror didn't falter. It grew brighter, closer, swallowing the world behind me. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and the forest on either side blurred into an endless wall of black. The radio screamed now. No music, just static and garbled voices, as if 100 people were shouting underwater. The sound clawed at my brain, making it hard to think. I reached for the dial, desperate to shut it off, but it wouldn't budge. A figure appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the road again. It wasn't the man from before. It was taller, thinner, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head lolled to the side as if it couldn't hold it up. And its eyes, God, its eyes glowed the same blinding white as the light behind me. I yanked the wheel to the left, narrowly avoiding it, and felt the car's tires hit gravel. My heart stopped as the vehicle skidded, the steering wheel jerking out of my hands. I was certain I'd crash into a tree. but the car swerved back onto the road as if pulled by an invisible force. That was when I heard the laughter. It wasn't from the radio or the road. It came from inside the car. I didn't dare look around. My eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, where the forest began to thin, revealing a stretch of open field. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, echoing in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was mocking or joyous, but it chilled me to my core. "Keep driving," a voice whispered from the passenger seat. I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over. The passenger seat was empty, but for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to shift, forming a faint outline of a figure hunched over, watching me. Its face was obscured, but its presence pressed on me like a physical weight. The light in the rearview mirror was gone now, but I didn't dare slow down. My car roared across the field, the tires thumping over uneven ground. The open space should have felt like relief, but the darkness here was heavier, more oppressive. It swallowed the stars and the moon, leaving only my dim headlights cutting through the void. Then my engine sputtered. No, I muttered, slamming my foot on the pedal. The car jerked forward but lost speed, its protests growing louder with each passing second. Finally, it rolled to a stop, the engine clicking as it died. The headlights flickered, then went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. For a long moment, there was silence, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the dirt behind me. My breath hitched, my entire body trembling. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on its flashlight, but it slipped from my hands and fell somewhere under the seat. The footsteps stopped. A faint glow appeared in the distance, the same orb of light I'd seen earlier. It hovered, pulsating like a heartbeat, and slowly began to move toward me. I scrambled out of the car, my legs weak, my body screaming to run, but unable to obey. The orb floated closer, illuminating the field in its eerie, shifting glow. And then I saw them. Figures stood all around me, their outlines faint and flickering, like static on an old TV. They were just outside the orb's reach, encircling me. Their faces were blank, no features, no eyes, just smooth, pale surfaces that tilted toward me as if watching. The orb stopped a few feet away, hovering in the air. I stared at it, mesmerized, as it began to change. Its light dimmed, revealing a swirling, gas-like surface that twisted and turned. The figures stepped closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. I forced myself to move, stumbling backward. My hand brushed against something cold and metal. The car's door. Without thinking, I climbed back inside and locked the doors, as if that could protect me. The orb didn't follow. Instead, it began to stretch and shift, forming a long, thin shape that resembled an arm. The limb extended toward the car, its fingers tapping gently on the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. The radio crackled to life again, this time with a single clear voice. Run. The orb exploded in a blinding flash of light, and I screamed, shielding my eyes. When I dared to look again, the figures were gone. The field was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of my engine sputtering back to life. I didn't question it. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not caring where the road led, as long as it was away. The orb's glow lingered in my rearview mirror for miles, like a distant star, before finally fading into the night. I made it home just before dawn, my hands still trembling as I shut the door behind me. Sleep didn't come that morning, or the next night. I still see the orb sometimes, in the corner of my vision, when I'm driving alone, and I never ever take the back roads anymore. It's a quiet November night, and you're driving along a winding country road, the kind that feels endless, flanked by skeletal trees clawing at the dark sky. The kind of night where even the stars seem to shy away, leaving you under a dome of oppressive blackness. Your high beams carve a narrow path ahead, illuminating only the cold asphalt and the occasional reflector post. You weren't supposed to take this road, but the GPS rerouted you due to an accident on the interstate, and now you're here, on this godforsaken road, miles from anywhere. And then you see it, a figure. It's standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by your headlights. Instinctively, your foot eases off the accelerator. They're not waving you down, not signaling for help. They're just standing there, facing the road, facing you. Your brain tries to rationalize it. Maybe it's a stranded motorist, a jogger. But why here? Why now? The figure doesn't move. It's when you draw closer that the dread sets in. They're dressed in a coat far too light for the weather, their head hanging at an angle that makes your neck hurt just looking at it. You squint, heart hammering. Their face is obscured, shadowed, or maybe featureless. Your gut screams at you to keep driving. Just keep going. Don't stop. But something, some damnable magnetic pull, makes you slow down. You stop the car about 20 feet away. The figure doesn't react. It's as if they don't notice your car or don't care. You flick on your brights, flooding the road with light, and they're gone. No, not gone. Moved. You see them now, but they're off the road, deeper into the trees, standing just at the edge of the beam's reach, still as a statue watching. You don't know why, but you roll down the window just a crack. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's that human instinct to do the worst possible thing in a dangerous situation. Your voice feels small in the yawning silence. Hey, you need help? No response. The figure doesn't move, but the trees behind them sway slightly in the wind, or at least you think it's the wind. It's hard to tell because you hear nothing. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of crickets, just the engine's low growl and your own breathing, sharp and uneven. You start to second-guess yourself. Maybe you imagined them moving off the road. Maybe your tired brain is playing tricks. But then your headlights flicker. Not off, not entirely, but enough to make your stomach drop. The beams dim for a split second, and when they come back, the figure is closer. Much closer. They're at the edge of the ditch now, their face, or the void where their face should be, angled directly at you. Your chest tightens as you realize you can't make out any features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth expanse of pale skin. And then you notice something else. Their hands. Long, wrong. Like talons, hanging just a little too low, the fingers unnaturally thin and curling slightly, as if they're waiting to grasp something. Your survival instincts kick in. You slam the window shut and put the car in gear. You're not staying here. Not tonight. Not for anyone or anything. The tires screech as you take off, but as the car lurches forward, you feel a weight, a pressure, like someone's holding the back of the car, the rear view mirror. You know you shouldn't look, but your eyes dart to it anyway, and they're there, perched on the trunk, their hands splayed out against the glass, fingers stretching impossibly long. They're still featureless, but you swear you can feel them looking at you, through you. You scream and stomp the gas. The car roars, the tires find grip, and for a second, you think you're free. The figure slides off the back, disappearing into the dark road behind you. Relief washes over you in a cold wave, but then something taps the window. Once, twice, a rhythmic knock, deliberate and unhurried. It's coming from the passenger side. You whip your head around. The figure is sitting in the seat beside you, impossibly calm, hands resting on their knees like they've been there the whole time. The inside of the car reeks now, like wet earth and decay. You don't even think. You wrench the wheel to the side. The car fishtails, and you barely manage to keep it from rolling as it screeches to a halt in the middle of the road. You throw open the door and bolt into the woods, leaving the car behind. Branches slash at your arms and face as you run. You don't know where you're going, but anywhere is better than here. The figure doesn't chase you, at least not in the way you expect. You can't see them, but you feel them. Their presence is heavy, like the air is pressing down on you. Every shadow seems alive, every sound amplified. Finally, you burst into a clearing and collapse to your knees. The moonlight bathes the open space, giving you the first sense of security you've felt all night. You take a moment to catch your breath, the cold seeping into your skin as you sit there trembling, and then you hear it. The knock. Once, twice. You whip around, and there, at the edge of the clearing, the figure stands. Only now, they're not alone. Dozens of them emerge from the trees, identical and featureless, their long fingers curling and uncurling as they close in. They form a perfect circle around you, their movements synchronized, their heads tilting in unison. Your scream catches in your throat as they close the gap, their smooth faces mere inches from yours. And then, blackness. When you wake up, you're in your car. It's parked neatly at the gas station you stopped at before this nightmare began. The sun is rising, the orange glow spilling over the horizon. The engine is off, your keys in your lap. Everything looks normal, except for the muddy handprint smeared across your windshield. The road stretched out endlessly, swallowed by a dense fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The motel sign, flickering dimly, read, "Rest Haven Inn, vacancy." It was a beacon in the darkness, though not the kind you'd want to follow. I didn't have much of a choice. My car's engine sputtered to a halt miles back, and my phone had barely a sliver of battery left. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the hood as if trying to drown the world itself. I stepped out, drenched in seconds, and made my way toward the peeling sign. The motel was one of those places you'd drive past without a second glance. Paint chipped off the walls, the once pristine white now a sickly yellow. A neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window of the office, the light barely illuminating the single desk inside. As I entered, a bell above the door let out a harsh jingle. The man behind the counter was gaunt, his sunken eyes fixed on a small, old-fashioned TV playing static. He didn't look up until I cleared my throat. "Room?" he croaked, his voice a rasp that set my nerves on edge. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "For the night." He slid a key across the counter, its brass surface tarnished. "Room 7. Don't mind the noise." Noise? I didn't ask. I should have. The hallway to room 7 smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet squished under my boots. The flickering light bulbs above cast strange, shifting shadows along the corridor. I turned the key in the lock, pushing the door open to reveal a cramped room with outdated furniture. A single lamp illuminated the space, its glow barely fighting back the encroaching darkness. I dropped my bag on the bed and exhaled. The rain beat against the window like 1,000 desperate hands. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. That was when I heard it. A faint scratching noise, coming from inside the closet. I froze, the weight of the room pressing down on me. The sound was faint, rhythmic, like nails dragging against wood. My rational side kicked in, whispering that it was just the rain or the old building settling. But something deeper, primal, told me otherwise. I took a hesitant step toward the closet. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and the noise stopped. Dead silence. Even the rain seemed to hush, as if the world was holding its breath. My hand trembled as I reached for the closet door handle. With a sharp yank, I flung the door open. Empty. Just a few rusted hangers swaying gently on the rod, their movement likely stirred by the draft. I let out a shaky laugh, scolding myself for being so jumpy. But as I turned back to the bed, I noticed something. The closet wasn't empty anymore. The hangers were still. But a dark shape had appeared in the back corner. A mass, tall, hunched and silent, almost blending into the shadows. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. The thing didn't move. It was there, but wrong. The darkness seemed to warp around it, like it was swallowing light. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Nothing. And then, it lurched forward. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as my fingers refused to cooperate. Behind me, the thing shuffled closer, its breathing wet and raspy, like air being sucked through broken glass. I threw the door open and sprinted into the hallway, not daring to look back. The corridor stretched endlessly before me, far longer than it had been when I arrived. Every door I passed was closed, each one rattling violently as I ran. The flickering lights above dimmed, casting the hall in an eerie twilight. My lungs burned, my feet barely touching the ground as I reached the motel office. The gaunt man was gone. The static on the old TV had turned into faint whispers, an indistinct cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I slammed my fists on the counter, shouting for help, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, and I felt the presence behind me again. Turning slowly, I saw it standing at the entrance. Only now, it was clearer. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and contorted. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, save for a slit that opened and closed, emitting that sickening, raspy breath. It stepped forward, and the motel seemed to shudder around us. Walls cracked, and the air grew dense, like trying to breathe underwater. I stumbled backward, grabbing at anything I could use as a weapon, my hand closing around an old desk lamp. Without thinking, I hurled it at the thing. The lamp shattered on impact, and for a brief moment the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a broken projection. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The rain hit me like a wall as I burst outside, the neon sign flickering violently above the door. My car, dead just hours ago, sat in the lot, its headlights glowing faintly. I didn't question it. I jumped in, turned the key, and, miraculously, the engine roared to life. As I sped down the empty road, the motel disappeared into the fog behind me. But even as I put miles between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rain on the windshield looked darker, thicker, almost like tar. The whispers from the office were still faintly audible, growing louder as I drove. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure sitting in the back seat. There's something about motels that never feels right. Maybe it's the lingering scent of bleach failing to cover something worse, or the flicker of a neon sign casting shadows where there shouldn't be any. That night, I pulled into a motel on a desolate stretch of highway, half dead from exhaustion and fully creeped out by the empty lobby. No one stood at the reception desk, just a small bell and a paper with the word "ring" written in shaky, faded letters. I hit the bell once. The ding echoed like I'd stepped into a void. Seconds dragged, then a door creaked open behind the counter. A man shuffled out, a clerk, I assumed. His uniform was stained, his posture stooped like something heavy was pressing on his shoulders. His face was pale, the kind of pale that doesn't come from lack of sun, but something deeper, almost wrong. He handed me a key without a word and pointed down the dimly lit hallway. Room 107. I hesitated. Something about the key gave me pause. It was old, heavy brass, engraved with symbols too worn to read. "Everything okay?" I asked. The man didn't answer. He just turned, disappearing back through the door. I considered getting back in my car and driving until I hit civilization, but the fatigue anchored me. My brain whispered, "Just one night." The hallway stretched unnervingly long as I made my way to 107. The doors I passed seemed older than the building itself, their paint chipped and wood warped. The carpet squished under my feet like it had soaked up years of spills and secrets. When I reached my door, I noticed something odd. The door to room 106 was ajar. Dark inside, but I could see something swinging gently from the ceiling, brushing the edge of the frame. A chain? No, it looked like hair. I almost knocked, almost let my curiosity get the better of me. Instead, I hurried into 107, bolted the door, and let the heavy silence of the room settle around me. The bedspread was an unholy pattern of orange and green, torn in places. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. As I dropped my bag onto the bed, the first noise came, a low, rhythmic tapping from the adjoining wall. I froze. The tapping against the adjoining wall was faint at first, like fingers drumming on wood. My initial instinct was to rationalize it. Pipes, maybe. Or someone next door shifting in their bed. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, as though it was waiting for a response. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my nerves. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the room was so silent, I could hear the faint buzz of the flickering overhead light. Then there was a noise, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the carpet. It wasn't coming from the wall this time. It was coming from inside my room. My stomach dropped. The air grew cold enough for my breath to cloud in front of me. Slowly, I turned toward the closet. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. I stared, my pulse hammering in my ears. The dragging sound stopped. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, gripping its cold base like a makeshift weapon. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, from behind the closet door, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't clear words, more like a breathy murmur. But it was there, distinctly human. My fingers tightened around the lamp, and I forced myself to move. My knees shook as I took a step forward, then another. I stretched out a trembling hand and gripped the closet door. With a yank, I threw it open. Nothing. Just empty space, an old coat hanger, and a sour smell. I exhaled a shaky laugh, my body still tense with adrenaline. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, shutting the door with a sharp click. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was hanging on the opposite wall, just above the small dresser, and in its reflection, I saw the closet door swinging open again, slowly, silently. But it wasn't empty this time. A figure stood there, too tall to fit in the closet naturally, its head hunched at an unnatural angle to avoid brushing the ceiling. Its limbs were impossibly long, its skin a grayish tone. The face, if you could call it that, was featureless, except for a mouth stretched into a gaping, soundless scream. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The thing stepped out of the closet, moving with a jerky, almost puppet-like motion. Into the mirror, I could see it approaching, its elongated arms stretching toward me. My fight or flight kicked in. I dropped the lamp and bolted for the door. The air grew heavier with every step, as though something was pulling me back. My vision blurred, and my ears were filled with a deafening, static-like hum. I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it behind me. I ran. The hallway seemed endless, the dim lighting flickering erratically. My chest burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. When I reached the lobby, it was empty again. The clerk was nowhere in sight. I burst through the front doors into the night, gasping for air. The neon sign above the motel flickered ominously as I fumbled for my car keys. When I glanced back at the building, I saw it. Room 107's window, glowing faintly. The curtain moved as if something or someone was watching me leave. I didn't stick around to find out. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just needing to put distance between me and that place. Eventually, I pulled into a gas station and sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The clerk inside gave me a strange look when I stumbled in for water. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't feel it. As I paid, I noticed the TV behind the counter was playing the news. My stomach twisted as the headlines scrolled across the screen. Missing persons reports filed for guests of the Highway Motel. Authorities investigating multiple disappearances. The screen flashed photos of the missing. One of them looked eerily familiar, a face I'd seen in the mirror. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I just got in my car and drove, hoping to outrun the image burned into my memory. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd been marked that night, and no matter how far I drove, how fast, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. The motel's vacancy sign buzzed dimly against the pitch-black highway, each flicker of the neon a whisper, luring me off the endless asphalt. It was nearly midnight, and exhaustion clawed at my skin. The voice in my head reasoned it was just a place to rest, a shower, a bed, and nothing else. But the moment I stepped into the lobby, I knew something was wrong. The clerk, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a face like wax, barely moved when I rang the bell. His gaze dragged across my face and stuck to me like flypaper. "Room 12, he muttered, tossing a key onto the counter with a thud. Don't wander the property at night." The warning should have been my first red flag, but I was too tired to care, muttering thanks as I grabbed the key. The room was about what you'd expect from a roadside dive. Cracked wallpaper, a bedspread patterned with stains, and a lamp that buzzed when you turned it on. I dropped my duffel on the bed and leaned back, letting the thin mattress groan under my weight. Outside, the night was silent, too silent. Even on a rural stretch of highway, you'd expect crickets or wind, not this suffocating, unnatural quiet. My eyes closed, and I must have drifted off, but it wasn't sleep that woke me. It was the sound of something dragging across the pavement. I froze, my heart thudding in my ears. Slowly, I sat up, listening. The sound came again, a rhythmic scrape, like a shovel being pulled against gravel. It was close, too close. I crept to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty parking lot, the dim glow of the vacancy sign, and the shadow of the woods beyond. Then I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, and moving unnaturally, dragged something heavy across the asphalt. I couldn't make out much, but the glint of metal in its hand sent a chill up my spine. The thing it was dragging, it wasn't a bag or an object. It was limp, human. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I stood there paralyzed as the dragging sound faded into the woods. When I finally found the courage to step outside, the air was thick with a damp, metallic smell. The kind that clings to your throat and makes your stomach churn. The parking lot was empty, save for a dark smear leading toward the tree line. Against all better judgment, I followed it. My flashlight barely pierced the thick shadows of the woods, but the trail was unmistakable. Crushed grass, broken branches, and that same horrifying drag mark. The deeper I went, the colder it got. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that settles in your bones and whispers for you to turn back. And then I heard it. A low guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a laugh. It echoed through the trees, circling me. My flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was plunged into total darkness. When it came back on, I saw it. Standing just a few feet away was the figure. Its face, or what should have been its face, was covered in a stretched, leathery mask. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its grin, that grin was too wide, splitting its face from ear to ear. It tilted its head, studying me, before lifting the object in its hand, a rusted meat hook. I didn't wait for it to move. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor. The sound of its laughter followed me, growing louder with each step. I burst out of the woods, slamming into the motel door and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the flashlight. Then the dragging sound returned. This time, it was outside my room. I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the crack at the bottom. A shadow passed, and then a sharp, metallic tap echoed against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was testing the lock. In a panic, I grabbed my duffel and threw it out the window, crawling after it. As I hit the ground, the door splintered behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was back on the highway, the glow of the motel's vacancy sign fading in the distance. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I realized the truth. The motel clerk's warning hadn't been about the woods or the night. It had been about the room itself. Room 12 was locked for a reason. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. Not the gas station attendant, where I stopped to clean the blood from my hands. Not the cops when I tried to explain why my car was abandoned, miles down the highway. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words caught in my throat, like my brain refused to let them out. But I couldn't forget it. Couldn't shake the sound of the dragging. Couldn't scrub the image of that thing's face, or lack of a face, from my memory. I should have just moved on, left it as one of those unsolved mysteries that people chalk up to sleep deprivation or too much stress. But something about that night kept gnawing at me. Maybe it was the clerk's warning, or the unnatural quiet of the woods, or the fact that no one, absolutely no one, seemed to have stayed at that motel in years. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself Googling the place, scrolling through pages of reviews, local news stories, and any scrap of information I could find. It wasn't much. The motel didn't even have a name, just a vague listing on some outdated website that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. But I did find one thing: a forum post from years back, written by someone who claimed to have worked there as a cleaner. "Don't go near room 12, asterisk," it read. "If the clerk gives you the key, refuse it. People disappear in that room. I quit after what I saw. Couldn't stay another night." No details, no follow-up, just those cryptic words. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I kept digging, I found an old news article, buried deep, almost as if someone didn't want it to be found. The headline read, "Missing couple's car, found near abandoned motel." The photo of the couple hit me like a gut punch. The man's face was vaguely familiar, balding, middle-aged, with a slight limp. The same man I'd seen on the security footage in the lobby. The one who'd stepped out of that asterisk in the woods without a limp. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Could it have been a coincidence? Some sort of strange, twisted hallucination? No, I'd seen too much. Against every instinct, I made the decision to go back. Not for answers. I doubted I'd get those. But to make sure that whatever was in that room, in those woods, couldn't hurt anyone else. The drive was longer this time. The highway felt emptier, darker. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, the neon vacancy sign was flickering, like it had been waiting for me. The clerk was gone, the desk empty. The place looked even worse than I remembered. Cracks in the walls, windows boarded up with rotting plywood. But the key to room 12 was still on the counter, resting on a layer of dust, waiting. I grabbed it and made my way down the hallway. My flashlight's beam cut through the dark, revealing peeling paint and doors hanging off their hinges. Room 12 was at the end, its door intact. The number was barely visible, scratched into the wood like someone had tried to erase it. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I slid the key into the lock. The room was cold, not the kind of cold you'd get from a busted heater, but a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to suck the air from my lungs. The bed was still there, the same stained mattress sagging in the middle, but the rest of the room, it was empty, stripped bare, like it hadn't been used in decades. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I whipped around, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The temperature dropped further, frost creeping across the window like icy veins. Then I heard it. The dragging sound, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from under the bed. I froze, every instinct screaming for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The dragging grew louder, closer. Then slowly, a hand emerged from the darkness beneath the bed. Not a human hand, too long, too thin, its nails blackened and curling like claws. It gripped the edge of the mattress, and then another hand followed, pulling the rest of it into view. The figure was the same as before, faceless, grinning, its body twisted and wrong. But now, I could see what it was dragging behind it. Me. It was my face, my body, limp and lifeless, staring back at me, with dead eyes. The room spun, reality unraveling, as the figure crawled toward me, its grin widening. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. But before the void consumed me, I heard the voice of the clerk, faint and distant. "I told you, don't wander at night." I woke up in my car, parked miles from the motel. The key to room 12 was in my lap, and my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. I don't know how I escaped. I don't know if I escaped, but every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear the dragging sound again. You'd think that driving an 18-wheeler through endless highways at night would make you immune to fear. I mean, I've seen it all. Road rage, accidents, even a guy walking naked on Route 66 like he was auditioning for a horror flick. But what happened last month? That wasn't the usual trucker nightmare. That was something else. Something wrong. I'm hauling cargo across Nebraska, about 2 a.m. The road is a strip of black slicing through miles of flat nothingness. It's quiet except for the steady hum of the rig's engine, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts wander to dark places. Then, my CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, you out there?" The voice was low, shaky. I hesitated. Usually it's other truckers chatting about routes, weather, or just swapping jokes to kill the boredom. But something in his voice had me grabbing the mic. "Yeah, this is long haul. What's up?" Static hissed for a moment before his reply came through. I think I'm being followed. Followed? I asked, gripping the wheel tighter. My eyes scanned the rearview mirrors out of reflex, even though I knew the highway behind me was empty. You sure about that? Ain't nobody out here but us. The radio crackled again, and his voice came through more frantic this time. It's not a car. I don't know what it is. It's been tailing me since mile marker 240. Every time I look back, it's closer. Closer? What are you seeing, man? I asked, feeling a bead of sweat roll down my temple. Nebraska highways don't exactly have streetlights, and whatever he was dealing with was probably some stray animal or a trick of the dark. He didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a long pause, filled only with static, before he finally whispered, "Eyes." "Eyes?" I repeated, my stomach tightening. "Yeah," he said, his voice trembling. "Like headlights, but wrong. Too low to the ground, and they flicker, like they're blinking. I swear to God, man, it's watching me." I glanced at my GPS. Mile marker 240 was about 10 miles behind me. Whatever was happening to this guy, it wasn't far off. "All right, buddy, stay calm. Where are you now?" "Just past mile marker 250. It's still back there, but it's closer. I can feel it." His voice cracked, and for the first time, I heard real terror in his words. This wasn't just highway paranoia. He truly believed something was after him. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a rest stop at 255. Bright lights, other truckers. Head there, and I'll meet you." "No," he snapped, almost yelling. "It won't let me stop. Every time I slow down, it gets closer. I can hear it, like claws scraping the pavement." My blood ran cold. I turned on my high beams, as if that would somehow protect me. "What's your rig?" I asked. "I'll look for you on the road." "Freightliner Cascadia. White cab, red trailer," he muttered. "But I don't think you'll make it in time." Then the radio went dead. I grabbed the mic again. "Breaker 19, you there? Talk to me." Static hissed in response. My heart pounded as I pushed the accelerator, the engine growling as the truck surged forward. I was determined to catch up to him, or at least see what the hell was going on. At mile marker 252, I spotted him. A white Freightliner with a red trailer barreled down the highway ahead of me, swerving erratically. His brake lights flickered, as though he was trying to stop, but couldn't. Then I saw them. Eyes. Two faint yellowish glows, low to the ground, darting in and out of the darkness behind his trailer. They weren't headlights. They were alive. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my palms slick against the steering wheel. The glowing orbs moved like they were studying him, stalking him. Then, they shifted focus. To me. I felt my chest tighten as the eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately, and locked onto my truck. Suddenly, the Freightliner veered off the road, its horn blaring in a panicked howl. It disappeared into the cornfields, leaving me alone with whatever had been chasing it. The glowing eyes began to speed up, closing the distance between us. I floored it. My rig groaned under the strain, the speedometer climbing past limits I knew weren't safe for a truck this size. But the eyes kept up, growing brighter, hungrier. The road ahead blurred as adrenaline coursed through me. Then I heard it. A scraping, like metal on asphalt. It wasn't coming from my rig. It was coming from underneath it. My radio came back to life with an ear-splitting burst of static. A voice came through, distorted and guttural, nothing like the man I'd been speaking to earlier. "You can't outrun it." The sound of claws raked across my trailer, and I felt the whole truck shudder. I gritted my teeth, swerving wildly to shake whatever was beneath me. The weight shifted, and I nearly lost control, the trailer fishtailing dangerously close to the edge of the road. Up ahead, the rest stop appeared like a beacon of hope, its floodlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The eyes vanished just as I burst into the parking lot, skidding to a halt amid a few other rigs. My hands trembled as I killed the engine and jumped out of the cab. Nothing. No glowing eyes. No claws. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chirp of crickets. Other truckers looked at me like I was crazy as I inspected the underside of my truck. Deep gouges ran along the metal, like something with claws had been clinging to it. My legs felt like jelly as I slumped against the side of the cab, breathing hard. "Hey, you all right?" one of the truckers asked, stepping closer. I opened my mouth to speak, but froze when I saw it. Out in the distance, just beyond the edge of the floodlights, two faint yellow eyes blinked. Then they disappeared into the darkness. I quit long hauls the next day. Let me tell you something. Long-haul trucking is not for the faint of heart, not just because of the endless miles or the isolation, but because of the things you see at night. I've been on the road for over 15 years, driving through every back road, highway, and nowhere town you can imagine. Nothing shakes me easily, but one night, one stretch of black asphalt made me question everything. It was a clear autumn night when I picked up a late delivery from a warehouse in Kentucky, heading west to Missouri. The load wasn't anything out of the ordinary, crates of furniture, some tools, but the route took me through a patch of the Appalachians that's more shadows than road after dark. Truckers call it the Devil's Backbone. Why? Because people and vehicles disappear there. But nobody ever really talks about it. We just drive. As I crossed into the mountains, the CB radio crackled. A gruff voice, another trucker said, "Breaker 19, anyone rolling through Backbone tonight might want to steer clear." Silence. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. Superstitions, I muttered to myself. Besides, I had a deadline to meet. An hour later, the road narrowed. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick trees overhead. My headlights fought against the ink-like darkness. The forest leaned too close, like it was watching. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, a shape darted into the road. I slammed on the brakes, my trailer screeching and groaning behind me. The truck stopped inches from what looked like a deer. No, not a deer. It was too tall, too thin. The thing turned its head toward me, and I swear its face wasn't right. Black eyes, like a doll's eyes, and its mouth, jagged like it had too many teeth. It tilted its head almost curiously before lurching away into the woods. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. My instincts screamed to keep driving, but my engine stalled. That's when I saw the scratches. 3 deep parallel gashes raked across my hood. Fresh, the kind no animal leaves behind. The CB buzzed again, but it wasn't static this time. A low growl came through, like an animal, or a man imitating one. "Still rolling, driver?" A voice rasped, half laughing, half snarling. I was about to radio back, demand who it was, but the air in the cab grew cold. Breath fogged in front of me, though my heater was blasting full, and the forest, so loud with crickets and wind minutes before, had gone dead silent. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, slow, something big, something deliberate. I refused to look out the window, but in my mirror, I saw the outline of something. Something tall, too tall. It stood just beyond the reach of my brake lights, watching. A gut instinct I'd never felt before screamed at me to stay in the cab. The truck finally roared back to life. I floored it, the trailer swaying as I tore through the twists and turns. The further I got, the more the feeling of being hunted lessened. But it wasn't over. 30 miles later, I pulled into a rest stop, one of those desolate lots with a vending machine and a flickering light. Another rig was parked there, engine off, but no driver in sight. I stepped out, my boots crunching gravel, and checked my hood. Those gashes. They weren't just scratches anymore. They were smoking, smoldering like they'd been branded into the metal. And then, from the woods beside the lot, came a laugh. Not a man's laugh, not a child's laugh. It was distorted, like a tape player chewing on a bad recording. The hairs on my arms stood on end. "Driver," the same voice from the CB crooned, but this time it wasn't over the radio. It was in the air, behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just my truck, just the woods. But deep in those trees, I swear, I saw eyes. Not two, dozens, blinking in unison. I didn't stay to find out what they belonged to. I climbed back into my rig, locked the doors, and drove until dawn. When I finally reached Missouri, the scratches on my hood were gone, replaced by pristine metal, like nothing had ever happened. But I know what I saw. And every time I pass through Appalachia, I see those same blinking eyes in my nightmares. If you're driving through the Devil's Backbone, keep your eyes forward, your windows shut, and don't stop for anything. A week passed, but the shadows of that night followed me. Truck stops felt quieter than usual, the roads darker, and the CB radio, even when silent, felt ominous. The scratches may have disappeared from my truck, but the memory of them burned in my mind. And then, the real nightmare began. My next haul was a routine trip, heading south toward Alabama, a midnight run. As always, I preferred driving at night. Less traffic, more peace. But peace was the last thing I found. It started with my GPS going haywire. One moment it showed a straight route. The next, my truck icon spun wildly, as if I'd veered off-road. I checked my map, recalibrated, and pushed on. That's when I noticed something. The mile markers weren't right. Each marker was different. One read 142, then the next said 666. I laughed it off, thinking I was seeing things. But the markers grew stranger. End, turn back, and one that simply read run. The rational part of me fought to dismiss it, a prank, bad lighting, or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. And then I saw the rig. It was pulled over on the shoulder, headlights blazing. The truck looked abandoned, doors swinging gently in the breeze. I slowed, radioing out of habit. "Breaker 19, you need a hand, driver." Static. The closer I got, the more I noticed something wasn't right. The rig's cab was empty, but the trailer doors hung open, swaying like something or someone had forced them apart. What stopped me cold was the graffiti scrawled across the trailer in thick black letters. "Nothing leaves." I slammed the accelerator. My rig roared forward, the abandoned truck disappearing in my mirror. About 10 minutes later, my CB crackled. "You left something behind, driver." A voice whispered, raspy and wet, like someone speaking underwater. "Who is this?" I snapped, my voice shaking. Silence. Then another sound, a scraping, like nails on metal. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't coming from the CB. It was coming from the trailer. Whatever it was, it had hitched a ride. My headlights caught a curve in the road ahead, forcing me to slow down. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was back there knew I was easing up. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding, until I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, leaving the engine running, and grabbed my flashlight. As I stepped out, the night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. The air was heavy, too quiet. I circled to the rear of the trailer, every crunch of gravel under my boots echoing too loud. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it at the doors. Deep gouges raked across the metal, forming patterns. No, symbols. My hands were sweating, but I reached for the handle. The moment I unlatched it, the doors flew open, and someone lunged at me. I stumbled back, falling hard on the asphalt. It was a man, or what used to be one. His skin was gray and stretched taut, his eyes sunken, but blazing with a sickly yellow light. His mouth twisted into an inhuman grin as he crawled toward me on all fours, faster than any human should. I scrambled back, yelling, "Stay the hell away!" But he didn't stop. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings, and his grin widened impossibly as he reached out. That's when I heard it. The sound of tires screeching, a horn blaring, and then the crunch of impact. Another truck coming around the bend had plowed into the figure, throwing it into the ditch. I staggered to my feet, breathing hard, as the driver of the other rig jumped out. "You okay?" he asked, looking me over. I pointed to the ditch, but when we checked, the thing was gone. Only a smear of dark, oily blood remained. We didn't talk much after that. The other driver offered to follow me to the nearest truck stop, and I didn't argue. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the entire time, I felt those eyes on me, watching, waiting. When I reached the stop, I parked, climbed into the sleeper, and locked every door. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness, that thing was still lurking. I never drove through the Devil's Backbone again, and I'll never forget the lesson I learned that night. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:43 a.m. The highway was dead, a straight ribbon of asphalt vanishing into the darkness. My CB radio crackled faintly with static, the voices of distant truckers trading stories to stay awake. I adjusted my cap and yawned, the hum of my 18-wheeler lulling me into a dangerous sense of calm. Then, out of nowhere, a voice broke through the static. "Eastbound on I-70. Anyone else seeing this?" The voice was shaky, breathless, like someone who just ran a marathon. I grabbed the mic. "Eastbound here. What's going on?" Static swallowed his reply, but I heard enough to send chills down my spine. "Black semi. No lights. Coming up fast." I shifted in my seat, suddenly wide awake. My headlights illuminated nothing but the road ahead, bordered by skeletal trees and the occasional mile marker. I checked my rearview mirrors. Nothing but empty black. "Anyone else out there?" The voice called again, this time frantic. "Calm down," I said into the mic. "Where are you exactly?" I think mile marker 82. It's behind me." "Oh God, it's right on me." The transmission cut out with a burst of static. My heart thudded against my rib cage. Mile marker 82 was about 10 miles ahead. I pressed harder on the gas, my truck rumbling as it picked up speed. I don't know why I felt compelled to go faster. Curiosity? Duty? Or maybe some primal part of me was already screaming, "You should turn back." 10 minutes later, I reached marker 82. The asphalt gleamed under my headlights, but the road ahead was empty. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter. My CB buzzed again, but it was faint this time, almost garbled. "Don't stop." The message made my skin crawl. I rolled my window down slightly, letting in the cold air. That's when I noticed something. The faint sound of a horn, long and mournful, echoing in the distance. It wasn't coming from the highway ahead. It was coming from behind me. I checked my mirrors again. This time, there it was. Far in the distance, but unmistakable. A massive black semi, its outline barely visible against the night. No headlights, no running lights, just a hulking shadow on wheels. My pulse spiked as I grabbed the CB mic. Whoever's out there, is this some kind of joke? I asked. But my voice betrayed the fear clawing at my throat. The response came in a whisper so faint I had to strain to hear it. It's not a truck. Don't stop. Don't let it catch you. The shadow in my mirrors grew larger. It was closing in, fast. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the roar of my engine filling the cab. My trailer swayed as my speed climbed past 80, then 85. But no matter how fast I went, the black semi kept gaining. Its horn blasted low and guttural, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't the horn of any truck I'd ever heard. It sounded almost alive. The CB crackled again, and the faint whisper returned. Don't look at it. Whatever you do, don't look at it. I didn't want to, but when the thing roared up beside me, I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head. The cab of the black semi was empty. No driver. Just a void where a driver should have been. The windows weren't tinted. They were black holes, devouring the light of my headlights. The truck's grille was bent into a wicked snarl, like some kind of metal maw. I yanked my eyes back to the road and slammed the accelerator harder. My truck groaned under the strain. The black semi swerved, its shadowy mass brushing against my trailer. Sparks flew, lighting the darkness like fireworks. Get off the highway, the CB hissed. There was an exit up ahead, barely lit by a single flickering lamp. Without thinking, I veered toward it, tires screeching as I took the turn too fast. My truck wobbled but held steady as I barreled down the narrow exit ramp and onto a deserted country road. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. The road stretched out empty before me, flanked by fields of tall grass swaying in the wind. My shoulders sagged with relief. But then the horn sounded again, closer this time, and my blood ran cold. In my side mirror, I saw it. The black semi was following me off the highway. "Leave me alone," I shouted into the CB, but the static gave no reply. The road grew narrower, twisting and turning through the darkness. The black semi's headlights, no, the absence of headlights, loomed behind me, swallowing the faint glow of the moon. Up ahead I saw it, a bridge, old, rickety, and far too narrow for two trucks. I didn't slow down. If the thing wanted to take me out, it would have to follow me across. The bridge groaned as my truck rolled onto it. Wooden planks creaked and snapped under my weight. I made it halfway across before I heard a deafening crash behind me. I glanced in the mirror and saw the black semi barreling onto the bridge. Its sheer size was too much for the old structure. The wood splintered and the bridge began to collapse. I floored it, the edge of the bridge just a few yards away. The black semi's horn blared one last time, a guttural scream that sent chills down my spine. Then the bridge gave out entirely. I felt my rear tires hit solid ground, just as the rest of the bridge crumbled into the river below. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop, my chest heaving. Behind me, the black semi disappeared into the churning water, its horn fading into silence. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the empty road ahead. The CB crackled once more, a final whisper cutting through the static. "You made it, but it'll be back." I never took that route again. Hell, I've never driven at night since. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't a truck. And if it ever comes for you, don't stop. Don't look at it, just run.